The first grey light seeps through the window as if it is being poured slowly from a pale jug, spreading across the ceiling beams and then down the lime-washed wall to where you stand. You move to the small shelf near the door where a shallow bowl of water and a bar of yellow soap wait. After scrubbing your hands and drying them on a square of coarse linen, you check the moisture in the air by habit rather than by instrument, pressing the back of one hand to the inside of the window frame. The glass is cool but not wet with condensation, and the raw wood of the frame gives no sign of swelling. Satisfied that the day is dry enough for the tight joinery ahead, you turn to the iron stove and open its small door to shift a half-burned log with the poker, bedding the fresh fuel into the glowing orange nest so that the workshop will remain steady in temperature for hours. The rhythm of these opening acts is as regular as breathing, and your mind drifts across them without resistance, like a leaf carried on a very slow stream. From the wooden chest beside the stove you take out the first tools of the morning, a slender marking gauge with a brass slide, a pencil cut to a blunt point, a fine-toothed handsaw hanging from its peg. You lay them side by side on the left end of the bench, aligning them with the edge, then take down the steel straight edge and hold it up to the lamplight to confirm there is no nick or burr on its edge. The blade glints once, faintly, and you set it across two bench dogs that you tap into their holes. Beyond the window the sky has lightened from ash to pearl, and you can just make out the bare branches of the apple tree in the garden behind the cottage. A solitary blackbird drops from a twig and stands on the grass, cocking its head. It finds nothing of interest and flutters away in a low arc. Inside, nothing moves except the flame in the lamp and the slow rise of a single wood mite drifting up from the pile of pine offcuts in the corner. You lift the lid of a small glazed jar that holds a collection of wooden pegs and pick out 3 of them, placing them into the pocket of your canvas apron. This apron, grey with age and patched at one knee, has been folded over the same hook each night for so many seasons that the creases have become permanent valleys in the cloth. You tie the neck loop and then the waist ties, adjusting them with the same 2 tugs you always give, and the weight of the tools already in the pouch pulls the fabric comfortably against your thigh. The lamp is trimmed now with a tiny pair of snuffers that you keep on the mantelpad above the stove. The wick coaxed to a steady small flame that will last until it is no longer needed. It has been necessary to light the lamp for over an hour each winter morning, but as the weeks inch toward spring, the hour shortens little by little, a change so gradual that you notice it only when you recall how dark it felt in December. Today, though, the light will be enough soon enough, and you could work without the lamp soon. Still, you leave it burning, because its small circle of yellow light adds a companionable warmth to the edges of the room. With your hands now loose and ready, you walk once around the bench, a slow circuit that is less a check than a ceremony. The stone floor, worn into shallow dips where your feet pass most often, feels cold through the soles of your thick wool stockings and leather shoes. At the far end of the bench, a stack of plank offcuts rests under a piece of sacking, and you lift a corner to see that the wood has not curled overnight. It lies flat, the ends pale and clean, the grain running straight. Farther along, the wooden tray that holds finished trap bases from the day before is covered with a linen cloth. You do not lift the cloth because you know the number that rests underneath, and there is no need to disturb them until the carrier arrives later in the week. The satisfaction of completed work does not demand to be looked at. It simply exists, a quiet fact in the room. Standing by the small window again, you pause to watch the mist that lies over the meadow beyond the garden hedge. The mist is thin enough that you can see the faint lines of the sheep fold near the oak tree, and beyond it, the pale stripe of the lane that leads toward the mill. The world outside is almost silent. The blackbird is gone. There is no wind to rattle the leafless ivy on the cottage wall, and even the distant rumble of a cart from the direction of the village is too far away to reach your ears. The whole landscape seems to be holding its breath, waiting for a sun that will not fully show itself today. You let your gaze rest on the damp silver of the grass for a full minute, then turn back to the bench because it is time to select the first plank for the day. You bring a rough-sawn plank of beech from the stack near the door and set it on the low trestles that you've already positioned at the center of the floor. The plank is about 3 feet long, 8 inches wide, and a full inch thick, with a straight grain that shows faint medullary rays in the lamplight. You rub a thumb along the edge where the sawmill left fine tooth marks, feeling the slight unevenness that the plane will later take away. After checking that the trestles are stable, you pick up the marking gauge and set its brass tooth to the width of a finished trap base, tightening the small wing nut until it bites. You draw the gauge along the plank's face, the steel pin leaving a shallow, bright line that follows the fiber without wandering, and then you mark a second line parallel to the first, and then a third, until the plank is divided into a neat row of rectangles. Each rectangle is exactly the same length and breadth, laid out with a patience that makes measuring feel like a form of rest. Now you take the handsaw and begin the work of cutting the blanks. The first stroke finds the curve left by the gauge, the teeth gripping with a gentle hiss, and you settle into the rhythm of pushing and releasing, letting the saw do its own work. There is no need to hurry, nor any wish to do so. The sound is a steady rushing whisper under the low ceiling, and with every stroke a little more pale dust spills onto the floorboards, fine as flour. You watch the cut advance, the blade descending through the plank until the weight of the off-cut end begins to sag, and you transfer your left hand to support it so that it does not tear the last fibers. When the piece drops onto the canvas sheet you have spread beneath the trestles, you place it to one side and begin the next cut, the saw finding the line as though guided by memory rather than sight. Hours could pass in this manner, and they often have, the stack of blanks growing with the same unhurried certainty as leaves accumulating under a tree in autumn. You pause only when the first plank is entirely reduced to 12 identical rectangular blanks, each one just over 5 inches long and about 3 wide. You gather the off-cut ends and toss them into the box beside the stove, where they will feed tomorrow's kindling. The blanks themselves you carry to the bench, laying them out in a single layer across the oiled surface, and then you open the bench vise and slide one inside, gripping it gently along its long edge. The plane is already within reach. You lift it with 2 fingers hooked under the toe, and check that the iron is still sharp from the honing you gave it at the end of yesterday. Your thumb grazes the edge lightly, testing, and the sensation confirms that no burr has curled over. A drop of oil along the sole helps it glide, and you press it forward across the face of the first plank, with a motion that uses your whole body, from the soles of your feet planted on the stone to the flex of your shoulders. The plane hisses and peels away, a translucent ribbon of beech, which curls up in front of the mouth and then breaks off, falling to join the sawdust below. You turn the blank and plane the opposite face, then the edges, checking with the straight edge after each pass until the surface is true and the thickness is uniform from corner to corner. The smoothness that emerges under the plane is cool to the touch, and slightly glossy, as if the wood itself contains a hidden polish that only a sharp iron can reveal. This process you repeat with each blank, working through the row from left to right, the plane singing its same quiet note again and again, the shavings piling up until they reach your ankles. Every so often you stop to run the straight edge across a face and find it perfect, and in that pause you might notice that the lamp's flame has begun to look paler because the sky outside is now fully grey with the approach of true daylight. The blackbird returns briefly to the grass and then flies off again. A very distant church bell sounds the half-hour, so faint that you feel rather than hear it. Inside the workshop the air has grown steadily warmer, warmed by the stove and by your own movement, and it carries a mixed scent of linseed oil, beech sap, and iron. The same mixture of smells has lived in this room for years, soaking into the plaster and the rafters, and it means nothing to you beyond the ordinary comfort of familiar things. When all the blanks are planed and smooth and true, you stack them neatly at the back of the bench and brush the shavings from the surface into a wide basket that you keep under the window. You will use the shavings later for packing or for lighting the kitchen fire, and so you press them down firmly to make room for more. The floor gets a quick going over with a short bristle brush, the bristles hissing across the stone, and then you are ready for the next stage of the day's work, which will be the cutting of the notches. But that is not for this hour, for now the first part of the morning is complete, and you feel in your muscles the gentle tiredness that comes from steady, careful labor undertaken without haste. The workshop is fully ready, the wood is prepared, and you take a dipper of water from the pail by the door, drink it slowly, and look out once more at the unchanging grey meadow, where the mist is only now beginning to lift, and the day still has many quiet hours to offer. The planks the drayman left at the gate the previous afternoon are stacked against the low stone wall where the lane curves past the hawthorn hedge, and you walk out to them as the grey morning settles over the cottage with a stillness that feels almost solid. The grass under your feet is wet with dew that has not yet dried, each blade heavy and bent, and the cool air carries the distant smell of wet earth and the faint mineral scent of flint from the fields. You untie the tarred cord that binds the load, looping it into a neat coil that you hang on the gate post. Then you lift the top plank clear and set it on the dry side of the wall where you can examine it properly. The rough sawn surface is spotted with pale flecks of lichen that have already begun to dry and curl at the edges from the short journey in an open cart, and you brush them away with the side of your hand. The plank is elm, a good dense piece with a straight grain that runs without interruption from end to end, and you turn it over to check the underside for knots or shakes, finding only a small sound knot the size of a farthing, tight and solid. You tap the wood with a knuckle and listen, not for any particular note, but for the absence of a dull thud that would suggest internal decay or a hidden split, and the plank answers with a clear short ring that tells you it is sound. You do this same test on 7 more planks, varying the spot where your knuckle lands so that each test sounds a little different while still reassuring you that the timber is good. Not all the planks are elm. The drayman has mixed the load according to your standing order, 3 planks of beech, 2 of deal, and the remainder of elm, each selected at the timber yard for use in different parts of the traps. The beech you need for the bases, because it is close-grained, and planes to a surface sleek enough that the wire spring will mount without catching, while the deal, lighter and easier to carve, serves for the treadle pieces that will be shaped later. The everyday heroes, the everyday hift in Silegsummer 5, resisting splitting that might ruin a weaker wood under constant spring pressure. You separate the planks into 3 small piles beside the wall, dragging each one across the turf so that the lower side picks up a damp smudge from the grass, and then you stop to wipe your hands on the front of your apron while you consider how many of each type you will need for the week ahead. The granary order that arrived with the carrier last Friday calls for 2 full crates by Thursday next, a number that you know without consulting the slate because you counted it out as soon as the letter was read. 40 traps per crate, 80 in total, and you have already cut and planed enough bases from yesterday's stock to account for perhaps half of that number. That means you need 40 more bases, so you will take in 2 beech planks today, a stack of deal, and a single elm plank for the catches, leaving the remainder in the open air under a piece of oilcloth that you fetch from the workshop and spread carefully over the pile, weighting its corners with stones that have been used for this purpose so many times that they have worn shallow nests into the earth. You carry the first beech plank inside under one arm, its weight making the tendons in your wrists stand out, and you set it across the trestles that you have already moved to the center of the workshop floor. The second beech plank you fetch next, then the deal and the elm, and you lean them against the wall near the trestles so that the whole morning's supply is within reach. The workshop has warmed now from the stove you lit before you went outside, the iron sides of the little heater ticking softly as the metal expands, and you pause for a drink of water from the pail by the door before you take up the marking gauge. The oil lamp still burns, though the window now admits a flat grey light that makes the lamp's flame seem pale and unnecessary, a companion rather than a tool. You move the gauge's brass slide until the steel pin sits exactly 1¼ inches from the guide fence, the distance you need for the width of the trap side rails, and you tighten the wing nut with a small twist of your thumb and forefinger. From the pocket of your apron you take a stub of carpenter's pencil and sharpen it with a few quick strokes of your pocket knife, the blade making a sound like a tiny mouse scratching, and then you lay the pencil along the bench edge where it will remain until you need it again. The first beech plank lies on the trestles with its rougher face upward, the sawmill's vertical tooth marks catching the light as faint parallel ridges that run the full length. You set the marking gauge against one long edge, press the steel pin into the surface, and draw it toward you in a single smooth pull, the pin scratching a line so fine that it seems more like a reflection than a cut. You move the fence over 1/4 inch to account for the saw curve and score a second line, and then you repeat the process down the width of the plank until you have described 6 identical rectangles across the face, each one the shape and size of a finished trap base. The gauge's wooden body is worn dark where your palm grips it, a smooth, shallow depression polished by years of exactly this motion, and it fits your hand as comfortably as a door handle. You set the gauge down and pick up the pencil to mark the crosscuts, using a wooden tri-square whose blade you hold flush against the plank's edge while you draw a thin black line across the grain at each interval. The lines are spaced by a measuring stick you keep on a nail above the bench, a simple strip of deal with the distance notched into its edge, and you place it against the plank, align the notch, and make your mark with the patience of someone who knows that accuracy now prevents misalignment later. The series of pencil lines and gauge scratches creates a faint grid that divides the raw plank into its predetermined parts, a map of the morning's simple labor. When the first plank is fully marked, you slide it forward so that 6 inches of its end overhang the trestle, and you take the fine-toothed handsaw down from its peg. The saw's wooden handle is applewood, yellow-brown with a dark streak through the center, and it fits your grip with a balance that makes the blade feel like an extension of your arm. You place the teeth against the first pencil line, the saw's curve catching the faint groove left by the gauge, and you begin the first cut with a short draw backward to establish a track. Then the forward stroke, a push of the arm that makes the teeth bite with a sound like a long, quiet exhale, and the stroke back, lighter, the whole rhythm settling into a pace that matches your own resting heartbeat. You do not press down on the saw, you simply guide it, letting the weight of the blade and the angle of the teeth do the work, and the curve deepens with each pass, while a fine spray of pale sawdust lifts from the cut and drifts down across the trestles and the packed canvas sheet below. The light from the window, still grey and diffuse, catches the dust motes in the air and turns them into a slow-moving haze that hangs around your shoulders, and the scent of fresh beech, a smell like faint nuts and clean wood smoke, fills the space between the bench and the stove. You cut the first blank free, catching it as it begins to drop, and you place it on the bench to your left with the sawn face upward. Then you reposition the plank, align the saw with the next line, and cut again. The hiss of the saw fills the workshop with a sound that is neither loud nor soft, but constant, a gentle friction that seems to push the silence outward to the edges of the room rather than breaking it. The pile of blanks grows slowly, each new piece landing on top of the last with a muffled clack that barely registers, and you find yourself sinking into a state where the boundary between your own intention and the motion of the task becomes thin. Your arm moves, the saw follows, the blank separates, the cycle repeats, and nothing interrupts it, because there is nothing here to interrupt it, because there is nothing here to interrupt. A spider, small and pale, descends from the ceiling beam on an invisible thread and lands on the corner of the trestle, and you notice it without stopping your work, just as you might notice a cloud passing. It walks across the wood, stops, and then climbs back up its thread until it vanishes into the shadows above the lamp, and the moment closes without consequence. The second beech plank replaces the first on the trestles, and the marking gauge scratches its lines, and the saw resumes its steady whisper. You have now cut a full dozen blanks from each of the 2 planks, 24 pieces of identical length and breadth, and you stop to gather them into a tidy stack at the rear of the bench. The edges are still rough from the saw, but you will plane those later in the day, after the midday meal perhaps, and for now the roughness is simply a stage in a sequence that you trust will unfold in its own time, like dough rising under a cloth. You drink again from the water pail, the dipper cool against your lips, and you notice that the low grey cloud outside has shifted enough to admit a thin shaft of watery sunlight that falls across the stone floor and lights up the grain of the planks leaning against the wall with a muted honey tone. The light moves a few inches while you watch, and by the time you turn back to the trestles, it is already gone, leaving the floor dull again. Such changes pass through the workshop all day long without being remarked upon, and they are no less part of the work than the saw and the gauge. The remaining planks of deal and elm you will not cut into bases, but you will need smaller blanks from them for the treadles and catches that will be whittled and shaped over the coming days. You mark out the deal plank in smaller rectangles, each about 3 inches by 1, using the gauge set to a narrower width and the pencil to cross-cut at shorter intervals. The deal is softer than the beech, and the saw moves through it with less resistance, the sound becoming a lighter, faster hiss that produces a sawdust more yellow, with a resinous scent that reminds you of pine forests far away. You cut the treadle blanks quickly, reduced by the softness of the wood from 20 strokes per cut to perhaps 10, and you stack them in a smaller pile beside the beech bases, their pale color making them look almost white against the darker grain of the beech. The elm plank you do not saw into small pieces yet, because the catches require a different set of cuts that you will make with a chisel and a mallet later. You simply set it aside on the floor near the stove, where the wood will stay warm and dry and ready for when you need it. Now the trestles are empty, the planks are all reduced to their rough blanks, and you take a moment to brush the sawdust from your apron and sleeves with a few sweeps of the hand. The canvas sheet beneath the trestles is covered in a thick layer of pale dust mixed with darker flecks, and you lift its corners and carry it carefully to the dustbin that sits outside the rear door of the workshop. Tipping the sheet, you watch the sawdust slide into the bin in a soft cascade that puffs a faint cloud up into the still air, and then you shake the canvas twice to dislodge the particles that cling to the weave before folding it and hanging it over the low branch of the apple tree to air. The bin you will empty into the compost pit behind the garden later, though the nicest of the clean pine dust you sometimes keep for cleaning the floor of the kitchen, and you make a mental note to set a bucket of it aside before the day is out. A small intention that will either be remembered or not, but nothing depends on it. You return to the workshop, close the lower half of the door against the chill that has begun to creep back, now that the weak sun has retreated, and you look at the piles of blanks on the bench. They sit in their neat rows, each one rough-edged and waiting, and the sight produces in you the same quiet satisfaction that a baker might feel, seeing loaves lined up before the oven. You lift one beech blank and sight along its edge, noting the faint saw marks that will disappear under the plane, and you feel the small weight of it, the way the wood is still cool from having been outside all night, slowly warming now in the shop's enclosed air. You place it back on the stack and pull the linen cloth over the pile to keep any floating dust from settling into the grain, though you know you will plane them soon enough that it hardly matters. The linen has a faded blue stripe and a scent of old starch, and it drifts down over the blanks as gently as a fall of snow. Your hands rest on the edge of the bench, and you let your gaze wander across the familiar shapes of the tools on their hooks. The darkening patch of wall behind the stove where the plaster has taken on a permanent smoke-brown patina, and the small window that now shows nothing but the grey sky and the topmost twigs of the hawthorn hedge. Somewhere far beyond the meadow, a dog barks twice and then is silent, and the sound reaches you so softened by distance that it is indistinguishable from a thought. The stove sighs as a log settles into ash, and you open its door to push the embers together with the poker and add a fresh split log from the basket, the bark crackling immediately as the heat takes hold. Morning has passed without any sign of its passing, except the pile of blanks on the bench, and the tiredness that now rests comfortably behind your eyes, the sort of tiredness that comes from sitting to a simple task and letting it carry you, like a boat drifting on a canal. You are ready now for the planing, but that belongs to the next stretch of the day, and there is no reason to rush toward it. The quiet holds, and you stand in it, a part of the workshop as much as the bench or the lamp or the steady, patient wood. The planing begins with a single beech blank taken from the stack you covered with the linen cloth, its sawn edges still rough, its wide faces marked by faint tooth strokes from the sawmill, and then from your own handsaw, you slide back the cloth and lift the first blank, a piece that weighs perhaps a little more than a teacup, and you set it on the bench between the two wooden dogs that you have already tapped into their holes with the heel of your hand. The bench dogs hold the blank along its long edges, leaving the face open to the plane, and you tighten the end vise by turning its wooden screw, a slow squeak of wood on wood that is so familiar you might not hear it at all anymore. The blank now sits firm, unable to shift or tilt, and you pass your palm over its surface to feel the texture that is about to be erased, a subtle roughness like the nap of a wool blanket. Directional, catching slightly when your hand moves against the grain. From the wall hook, you lift the smoothing plane, a tool whose body is of dense beech darkened by palm oil to the color of strong tea, its sole worn to a glassy polish along the last 2 inches behind the iron. You take it to the window and tilt it so the grey light falls into the throat, checking that the cutting iron sits square and that the chip breaker is snugged down against it without any trap shaving from the previous day. The iron's edge catches the light as a hairline of silver, and you confirm that it needs no further sharpening just yet, though you know that the beech will eventually dull it with its mild abrasive silica, So you keep the oil stone on the corner of the bench within reach, soaked in a shallow tin of neat's foot oil. You adjust the depth of cut by turning the brass adjustment knob a quarter turn clockwise, watching the iron descend smoothly until it protrudes so slightly that you can barely feel it with your thumb. This fine set will take a shaving as thin as onion skin, exactly what you need for the final smoothing. You position the plane at the near end of the blank. Rest your left hand lightly on the front knob and grip the rear tote with your right, the shape of the handle filling your palm like a handshake from an old friend. The first forward stroke requires only the slightest downward pressure at the start and a release at the end, a rocking motion that becomes automatic after the first 5 seconds. The iron enters the beech with a soft hiss, not the tearing sound of a roughing plane, but a clean whisper, and the shaving lifts from the throat and curls forward over your hand, translucent and continuous, pale honey-coloured, with the faint sweet scent of steamed beech. You complete the stroke, lift the plane, and draw it back without touching the wood, then push forward again, meeting the blank surface with a whisper that is exactly the same as the previous one, but never repetitive, because the wood's grain reveals new small variations each time. Here a fleck of darker heartwood, there a tiny medullary ray that shears off with a slight rise in pitch. The shavings collect around the mouth of the plane until you pause to brush them aside, a motion that takes perhaps 2 seconds, after which you resume the rhythm. After 6 passes, you stop and lift the blank from the vise, turning it end for end so you can plane with the grain rather than against it, because the beech fibre lies at a shallow angle that you noted earlier when you cut it. The reverse blank settles into the dogs again, and you repeat the strokes, the plane now moving away from you toward the window with the same steady speed, the light from the grey sky shimmering along the wet-looking path left by the iron. The surface that emerges from this second series is already markedly smoother than the sawn texture, with a sheen that reflects the faint glow of the oil lamp, though you will not be satisfied until the straight edge tells you it is true. You place the straight edge across the blank's width, then along its length, then corner to corner, peering for any glimmer of daylight between the tool and the wood. A tiny sliver of light shows near the far left corner, a gap no thicker than a hair, and so you mark that spot with the side of your thumbnail and plane it again with a shorter, lighter stroke that barely whispers, and then you check once more. The straight edge now sits dark against the wood along its whole length, no light penetrating, and you feel the confirmation as a quiet stillness in your mind rather than any distinct thought of satisfaction. You remove this finished blank and set it on a new pile at the far left of the bench, a pile that will eventually contain all the smoothed bases, and you slide the next rough blank into the vise. The dogs need a small tap from your mallet to adjust for a slight difference in width. This second blank is perhaps a 32nd of an inch wider, a trivial variation absorbed by the wooden dog's slight give. You tap the nearer dog with the apple wood mallet, a soft thock that hardly disturbs the air, and the blank stands ready. The plane's iron is still sharp. The sole still carries a thin film of oil from the previous piece, and you do not pause to inspect anything because nothing has changed. You lower the plane to the new wood, feel the same initial resistance, and then let the stroke flow just as before, the shaving lifting and curling and falling to the growing drift of pale ribbons at your feet. The process continues across 6 blanks, each one receiving the same treatment. Clamp, plane the face, turn, plane again, check with the straight edge, mark any high spots, plane the spots, check once more, and then set the finished base onto the pile. The sound of the plane becomes a continuous background tone, a low shh that fills the workshop like rainfall on a distant roof, and you fall into a state where your eyes see only the wood in front of you, and your ears hear only the plain song, and your body sways slightly forward and back with each stroke in a rhythm that your own breath matches. The lamplight, now entirely superfluous, continues to burn because you have not paused to snuff it, and its flame writes a small golden reflection on the shiny surface of the completed bases. The pile of smooth blanks grows, and the pile of rough blanks shrinks, and the space between them stays constant, a small world where nothing enters or leaves except dust motes drifting up from the shavings. When the 7th blank is clamped, you feel the first slight drag in the plane's cut, a sign that the iron has begun to round over its keen edge from the silica particles embedded invisibly in the beech. The plane still cuts, but it requires a fraction more downward pressure, and the shaving that lifts is no longer perfectly continuous, but breaks into short, crisp curls that scatter instead of coiling. You finish the face you are planing, unclamp the blank, and set it aside still slightly less than perfect, because you will return to it after sharpening. The plane you carry to the corner of the bench, loosening the lever cap with a turn of the brass screw, and you slide the iron and chip breaker assembly out of the throat, careful not to touch the edge with your fingers. You separate the two parts, lay the chip breaker on the bench, and hold the cutting iron up to the window light, where its edge reveals a faint line of shiny dullness. Not a nick, simply a blunting that you will now remove. The oil stone in its shallow tin is a block of dense, speckled stone, worn slightly hollow in the middle from years of use, but still flat enough for a smoothing plain iron. You add a few drops of neatsfoot oil from the small glass crute, spreading it with a fingertip until a thin film covers the center. Then you place the iron bevel down on the stone and begin a series of small circular motions, the blade moving with a wet, gritty sound that is higher in pitch than the plane's whisper, but equally calm. You count no circles, and you hurry none. The circles simply follow one another until the bevel has acquired a uniform grey sheen, and then you tilt the iron to the exact angle of the bevel and stroke it straight backward and forward across the stone. The motion of an oar dipping into water, over and over. After 20 or 30 such passes, you turn the iron over and lay the flat back side on the stone. A delicate touch that removes the wire burr you can feel with your thumb. A tiny ridge of steel that peels away in a dark smear on the oil. A final stropping on a piece of leather dressed with jewelry's rouge, a quick pull back and forth, and the edge is now sharper than it was new, catching the light in a flash that makes you squint. You reassemble the plane, set the depth knob, and test it on a scrap of deal that lies always at the end of the bench for this purpose, and the blade enters the soft wood as if sliding into butter, leaving a surface that gleams wet and satiny. With the plane newly sharp, you return to the seventh blank and complete its face in 2 long strokes that hiss with renewed clarity, the shaving peeling away in a single translucent ribbon over the length of the blank, and the straight edge shows perfect flatness. This blank joins its companions, and you move on to the 8th, the 9th, the 10th, each one planed with the same careful routine, but never identical, because the grain in every piece presents a slightly different figure. Here a gentle curve, there a small group of pin knots, no bigger than poppy seeds, here a faint ripple that suggests the tree grew near a hedgerow where the wind bent it a little each winter. You notice these variations as a weaver might notice a knot in the thread, registering them without stopping, adjusting your plane's angle by a few degrees to accommodate the local grain direction, lifting slightly at the end of a stroke to avoid tear out near an edge, all of which requires no conscious thought because your hands have learned these adjustments over years, and now perform them on their own. Beyond the window the grey sky has begun to thin in one corner, revealing a patch of lighter cloud that might become sun or might not, and the blackbird that visited earlier returns to the grass, this time with a companion. The 2 birds poking the wet earth with quick stabs of their yellow beaks. You glance at them without lifting your hands from the plane, observing that the grass has started to show faint green near the roots where the frost has not touched, a colour so subtle that you would miss it if you had not spent so many hours looking out this same window. The sight means nothing beyond its own quiet presence, and you return your attention to the plane, and the blank and the soft build-up of shavings around your shoes. The shavings have now reached the height of your ankles, and you pause to gather them into the wide basket that you keep under the window, scooping armfuls of the dry, curled ribbons that crackle faintly as they settle. Some of the shavings are so thin that they are nearly transparent, and when you lift a handful to the lamp, they glow with an amber warmth that is just as brief as the moment it takes to drop them into the basket. You press the pile down to make room for more, because there are still many blanks to plane, and the basket will fill several times before the morning is over. The scent of beech shavings in the basket is denser than the airborne scent, sweeter and almost like bread, and you inhale it without thinking, as you do every time you clean the floor. The planing resumes, the 12th blank, the 13th, each one coming out of the remaining rough pile and being clamped, stroked, tested and deposited on the finished pile. Your back remains straight, your shoulders loose, your breathing deep and slow, because good planing requires a relaxed body, and the motion has become a meditation that you never name. Sometimes your mind wanders to the week's schedule, the delivery to the granary on Thursday, the carrier's route, the tally on the slate. But these thoughts drift across the surface and then sink away like a bubble on a mill pond, leaving only the plane's hiss and the faint resistance of the wood. The stove clicks softly as a fresh log begins to char, and the iron emits a tiny ping when it is half an hour has passed. But those sounds register only as gentle punctuation, not interruptions. When the second-to-last blank has been planed and stacked, you pause to stretch your arms upward, reaching toward the low ceiling beam, where the spider has now retreated to its corner, and you roll your wrists once, twice, feeling the slight warmth of well-used muscles. You walk to the water pail, dip the cup, drink the cool, flat taste that is absolutely plain, and then you return to the bench for the final blank of the morning's set. This last one is from the very end of the second beech plank, and it bears a small knot near one corner that you noticed when you sawed it. The knot is tight, its dark brown center slightly raised, and you plane it with extra care, taking the lightest possible strokes while listening for any change in tone that would indicate the iron is catching. The plane sings across the knot without grabbing, the iron slicing the dense grain cleanly, and the knot emerges as a small oval medallion on the smooth surface, glossy and dark against the honey beech, a point of character that the trap will wear silently under the granary floorboards. You check this last blank with a straight edge, find it flat, and set it on the finished pile with the same gesture you've used for all the others, a simple lowering of the hand that adds one more to the count. Now the pile of smooth bases numbers 24 pieces, each one a uniform rectangle of clean finished beech, their faces gleaming softly in the low light that fills the room from both the lamp and the window. The pile itself is a neat block, and you square it with two hands, patting the sides until it stands straight. Then you cover it with a linen cloth. The other pile, the rough blanks, is gone, transformed into the smooth ones and a basket full of shavings. You take a last look around the workshop. The tools are still on their hooks. The marking gauge rests by the tail vise. The plane sits on the bench, with a single thin shaving still caught in its mouth like a feather on a doorstep. The stove glows a steady low orange behind its grate, and the air in the room is warm and still, heavy with the mingled smells of oil, wood, and warm iron. A pale band of light now lies across the floor, the first true sun of the day having finally broken through the cloud, and it moves so slowly that you can only perceive its progress by looking away and then looking back. The light touches the corner of the basket, illuminating the transparent edge of a shaving, and then it moves on, leaving the basket in shadow again. You wipe the plane's sole with an oily rag, cleaning away the fine dust that has adhered to the thin film of oil, and you hang the plane back on its hook with the care you would give to a book you might read again later. The oil stone you slide back into its tin, closing the lid to keep the stone moist, and the leather strop you roll up and tuck into its small cubby under the bench. The straight edge is wiped, the marking gauge put away, the mallet set beside the chisels in their rack, and each small gesture is performed without hurry, a series of unobtrusive notes that close the morning's melody. Standing at the window now, you see that the sun has reached the apple tree, lighting the silver bark, so that it glows against the grey clouds behind it, and the grass below is steaming slightly as the dew evaporates. A light breeze stirs the topmost twigs, and then it dies, and the stillness returns like a held breath. You leave the workshop by the inner door that connects to the cottage, stepping into the small passageway where the scent of bread baking from the kitchen drifts through, warm and yeasty, and you close the door behind you with a soft click. The bases are ready. The pile under the linen cloth will wait quietly in the dim workshop, with nothing to do except exist, while you eat your midday meal. The plane's whisper has faded, and the only sound now is the distant singing of a kettle coming to boil, and that too is a kind of silence. The morning has stretched into a quiet noon, and you return to the workshop with the soft weight of a meal behind you. The taste of bread and mild cheese still faint on your tongue. The room has not changed in your absence. The stove hums a low heat, the oil lamp flickers though daylight now pours through the window in a steady grey-white sheet, and the pile of smooth beech bases still sits under its linen cloth on the bench. You lift the cloth and fold it once, twice, setting it aside on the windowsill. Then you bring the wooden tray from the shelf near the door and place it on the left side of the bench where it will wait to receive the finished pieces. This tray you made yourself many years ago from a single plank of deal, its edges rappeted and pinned with small brass nails, and it has held thousands of bases in its time, never complaining, its surface burnished to a dull sheen by the endless passage of smooth wood. You take a moment to wipe it with your palm, feeling no splinters, and then you turn to gather the tools you will need for the next stage. From the wall rack you select a narrow chisel with a blade of just 3/16 of an inch, its bevel ground to a long flat slope that gleams with the fine edge you honed yesterday. Beside it you take the small mallet of applewood, its head a dense rounded block shaped like a flattened egg, its handle warm from the stove's long radiance. You lay these on the bench next to a small square of hardwood that will serve as a cutting block, and you retrieve an awl from the shallow drawer under the bench, a simple steel spike set in a beechwood handle, its point sharp enough to scribe the lines of the mortise. A spare treadle piece, already cut and whittled to its final shape, acts as your gauge. You slip it from the glazed jar where it lives among its 50 identical siblings, and you put it in your apron pocket so it will be ready for testing. The jar, when you glance at it, is still half full from the last batch, and the little catches tumble slightly as the glass settles, a tiny sound like seeds shaken in a dry pod. You take the first smooth base from the pile and set it on the cutting block, positioning it so the long edge faces you, the better to see the careful layout you are about to scribe. The awl fits into your hand like a pencil, and you press its point lightly into the beech at the spot where the treadle slot must begin, an exact distance from the end of the base that you measure not with a rule, but with a small wooden story stick you keep in the apron pocket, a thin strip of deal cut to the length of the gap. You place the stick against the end, align its tip with the base's edge, and make a tiny indentation with the awl at the stick's far end. Then you slide the stick sideways by the width of the treadle and make a second mark. These two indentations define the ends of the rectangular mortise, and you connect them with a careful awl line drawn along a straight edge, the steel scribing a faint bright groove that catches the light as you lean closer. Then you mark the crosscuts, two short lines at right angles to define the mortise's width, and you blow a gentle puff of breath across the surface to clear the dust of the scribing, the fine particles lifting and vanishing into the sunbeam that now slices across the dark wood of the bench. All this marking takes perhaps a minute, a small series of actions performed with an unhurried exactness that makes time seem to slow around your hands. You set the straight edge down and pick up the narrow chisel, cradling its blade in your left thumb and forefinger while the right hand grasps the handle. The cutting edge has to enter the beech precisely along your scribed lines, so you bring it to the near crosscut and tip it slightly to match the angle of the mortise wall, which must be vertical and clean. The applewood mallet you now lift in your right hand, its weight balanced a short fall from the chisel's end, and you give the handle a light tap, a sound like a single drop of water falling into a wooden bucket. The chisel sinks a mere fraction, and you adjust its position and tap again, the blade entering deeper, the beech fibers severing with a tiny crunching sound that is more felt than heard. You work along the length of the mortise now, a series of light taps that move the chisel forward slowly, each tap a soft thock that repeats and repeats without ever becoming rhythmic, because your focus is on the cut, not the cadence, and so the intervals vary slightly depending on resistance. The blade moves like a tiny plough through the wood, lifting slender curls that are not curls at all but short, crisp chips shaped like miniature half-moons which heap up at the mouth of the mortise. When you have outlined the entire rectangle with this shallow cut, you lift the chisel and blow away the chips, a quick breath that sends them scattering across the bench, and then you deepen the mortise with firmer taps that raise the mallet higher, but still only by an inch or so, the force never enough to risk splitting the narrow walls. The chisel now peels longer shavings from the bottom of the mortise, and you use the bevel down position to keep the floor flat, prying the waste free with a gentle upward twist of the handle between taps. You can feel through the chisel wood the exact texture of the beech grain, slight variations in density that your hands read like a blind man reading a book. And you adjust the force of each tap accordingly without conscious thought, as though the mallet itself knows how hard to fall. The mortise deepens until it is exactly 1/8 of an inch deep, A depth you check by laying a small sliver of measured deal across the opening and sighting along it. And when you see that the sliver sits flush with the base's surface, you stop, pull the chisel free, and blow the cavity clean once more, the breath carrying away the last tiny crumbs that cling to the corners. Now you test the mortise with the spare treadle piece from your apron pocket. The treadle is a thin slip of deal, a little shorter than the mortise and slightly thinner, and you slide it into the slot with a push of your thumb, feeling for any resistance or binding. It drops into place with a faint scrape and then a soft bottoming out. And when you invert the base, the treadle stays in place, held by the walls of the mortise without being pinched. You tap the base on the bench, and the treadle rattles just a little, a tiny whisper of wood, and you know the fit is right. You remove the treadle, blow out the slot one last time, and set the finished base aside in the wooden tray at your left, its mortise a clean, dark rectangle cut into the honey-coloured wood. The second base you take from the pile, and you go through the same sequence, the story stick placed, the awl marking the ends, the straight edge drawing the line, the chisel following the scribe boundary with light taps, the removal of chips, the deepening of the mortise, the test fit, the final blow of breath. Each base receives exactly the same treatment, and yet no two are identical, because the grain of each blank guides the chisel slightly differently. On one, the mortise falls on a patch of softer early wood that cuts like cheese. On another, a faint late wood line offers more resistance, and you must adjust the mallet's force. You notice these differences as small variations in the day's texture, like the changing patterns of clouds beyond the window, and they drift through your awareness without lingering. The wooden tray slowly fills from its far end, the bases lined up in a row like paving stones, and you work across the bench from right to left so that the finished pile grows toward the tray and the raw pile shrinks toward the window. The tapping of the mallet becomes a gentle pulse that blends with the other sounds of the workshop. The soft tick of the stove, the sigh of air past the window frame, the infrequent creak of a roof timber settling under the low winter sun. The lamp still burns, though you could snuff it, and its small yellow bloom adds a companionable warmth to the corner of your vision, a small domestic sun that never sets. You reach for a fresh base, make your marks, cut the mortise, test it, stack it, and the loop repeats with a quiet regularity that might be called monotonous if the word did not imply boredom. You are not bored because the work is a form of rest that requires only enough attention to keep your hands safe and the cuts true, and the rest of your mind is free to drift across the room, out the window, following the blackbird that has returned once more to prod the wet grass with its sharp beak. Now and again you pause to sharpen the chisel on the oilstone, a short interlude of circular motions and the wet, gritty hiss of steel on stone, after which you strop the edge on the leather and feel with your thumb the renewed keenness that will slice the beech with less effort. During these pauses you might walk to the window and look out at the still grey sky, or you might take a drink of water from the pail, or you might simply stand with your hands resting on the edge of the bench while your eyes roam across the familiar shapes of the plane, the saw, and the gauge, all of them clean and ready, and then you return to the bench and pick up the chisel again. The hours move past you like slow water under a bridge, and the only measure of their passing is the growing weight of the tray and the diminishing pile of blanks under the linen cloth. By the time the last base in the first half of the stack has been mortised, the sun has shifted its angle through the window so that the patch of light that once touched the basket of shavings now falls across the wooden tray itself, illuminating the neat row of completed bases with a pale gold glow. You pour a dipper of water and drink it slowly, feeling the coolness slide down while you note that you are nearly halfway through the total needed for the granary order, a fact that brings neither pride nor relief, merely an adjustment to the afternoon's plan. You return to the bench and lift the cloth from the remaining beech blanks, each one still needing its mortise as well as the tiny notch on its underside that will anchor the spring. That notch is even simpler than the treadle slot, a small square cut barely a quarter-inch wide and only deep enough to catch the bent end of the wire. You turn the next base over so its smooth underside faces up, and you take a smaller chisel from the rack, a tiny bevel-edged tool with a blade no wider than your little fingernail. The awl scribes two short lines close together, and you position the chisel at one end of this new mark, the blade gripped between your thumb and first two fingers for precise control. The mallet you do not use for this cut. Instead, you apply pressure with the heel of your palm, rocking the chisel gently into the wood, severing the fibers with a quiet crunch that is so faint it sounds like a distant whisper. A tiny dark chip springs out, then another, and the notch takes form as a clean little pocket with vertical walls and a flat floor. You blow into it, check its depth by pressing the end of a spare spring anchor into the hole, and then when the wire seats snugly with no rocking, you turn the base right side up again and set it in the tray. This underside notch you cut on every base, one after another, the small chisel moving through the repeated gesture of rocking and lifting, each cut a brief task that consumes perhaps 30 seconds, but adds up over the remaining blanks into a quiet hour's labor. The tray now holds all the finished bases from the morning's work, every one of them smoothed, mortised, and notched. You run your hand over the row of them, feeling the cool, even surfaces, the shallow depressions of the treadle slots, the tiny anchor notches hidden below. They are identical to each other and identical to the thousands that have passed through this workshop over the years, and they will lie under the floors of granaries for decades, doing their quiet work unseen. You push the tray slightly to one side to make room for the next operation, though you have not yet decided whether you will begin shaping the treadles and catches now, or save that for the early morning when your eyes are freshest. The afternoon has begun to draw in, the grey light outside turning a shade darker, and the stove could use another log. So you open its door and settle a fresh piece of beech onto the coals before wiping your hands on the apron and turning back to the bench. The workshop has grown very still in the last hour, the tapping of the mallet now a memory held by the air, and the tools on their hooks seem to be resting as well. You look at the tray, the chisel, the little mallet, and you know that tomorrow you will shape the treadles and begin winding springs. But for now, the work is complete. The notches cut clean, the slots all true. Outside the window, the mist has thickened a little over the meadow, blurring the sheepfold into a soft grey shape, and the lane has disappeared entirely into the gathering dusk. The lamp, which has burned all day without notice, is now the brightest thing in the room, and you turn it up a fraction, the flame stretching taller and steadying into a placid golden teardrop, as you put the chisels back onto their hooks with a light click and brush the last wood crumbs into the wide basket that stands almost full of shavings by now. The first chapter of the day has been written in wood, and the workshop, warm and silent, settles into its evening. The offcuts you set aside earlier in the week sit in a small pile near the stove, a collection of beech pieces too narrow for bases but too sound to throw into the kindling box, each one about the length of your hand and the thickness of a thumb. You gather them now and carry them to the low stool near the window where the light falls strongest at this hour, a cool silver rectangle that has moved across the floorboard since morning and now illuminates the corner where you will sit. The stool is a simple three-legged thing you made long ago from a single round of ash, its top worn into a shallow dish shape from years of your weight settling onto it, and you pull it a little closer to the window so that the light falls directly on your lap. From a hook beside the window frame you take down the leather apron piece, a square of softened cowhide about the size of an open book, and you spread it across your left knee, smoothing it flat with the heel of your hand. The leather is dark brown now, almost black at the edges, polished by countless hours of small whittling tasks, and it carries the faint sweet smell of beech oil and beeswax. You sit down on the stool, feel the familiar creak of the wood accepting your weight, and position your feet flat on the stone floor so that your thighs form a level platform. From the pocket of your canvas apron you draw the thin-bladed knife you use for this work, a tool with a blade of high-carbon steel that has been ground so many times over the years that its shape has shifted from a straight edge to a gentle curve, a shape that fits exactly the concavity of the catch notch you will carve. The handle is a piece of yew, dark orange with age, its surface carrying the faint impressions of your grip, and you turn it in your hand to find the familiar orientation before you touch the blade to the first offcut. The edge you tested earlier on a scrap of deal and then stropped on the leather hanging from the bench. It is sharp enough to shave the hair from your forearm, a test you performed without thought before you sat down, and the blade now gleams in the window lights like a sliver of mirror. You pick up the first beech offcut and hold it close to your eyes, turning it slowly to observe the direction of the grain, the placement of the small medullary rays that fleck the surface, any tiny knot or irregularity that might steer the knife wrong. This piece is straight-grained and clean, the ideal blank for a trigger catch, and you orient it so the grain runs long ways, parallel to the cut you will make. The catch you are about to shape is a small angled piece, no longer than the first joint of your thumb, with a flat base that will sit against the trap bed and a sloped upper face that will hold the spring wire under tension until the treadle is pressed. You have made many thousands of these catches, each one identical in function, though ever so slightly different in form, because no two pieces of wood are the same, and the variations disappear into the mechanism without consequence. The knife blade touches the end of the offcut, the edge sinking into the beech with a tiny crisp sound, and you draw it toward you in a light paring stroke that peels away a thin sliver of wood, no thicker than a visiting card. The cut follows the grain, and the grain accepts the cut, the blade moving through the early wood with almost no resistance, and then slowing slightly as it crosses a line of darker late wood, a change in texture that travels up through the blade and into your fingers like a whispered message. You rotate the blank a quarter turn and make a second cut, defining the flat base, and then you turn it again to slope the upper face, the knife angling to create the precise bevel that will catch the spring wire without letting it slip. The tool moves in your hand with the ease of long practice, the strokes short and controlled, each one removing a curl of wood so fine that it drifts onto the leather apron like a pale eyelash. The rhythm of the knife is slower than the rhythm of the saw or the plane, more varied because each cut is a separate decision, and the pauses between strokes are part of the work rather than interruptions. After 6 or 7 strokes, you stop to compare the developing catch against the master pattern you keep in the glazed jar on the bench. The master is a catch you made perhaps 5 years ago, its shape perfected by trial and then set aside as a reference, and it is darkened to a rich amber, while the new catches will be pale when finished. You hold the new piece beside the master, squinting at the angle of the bevel, noting that the slope on the new piece is still a little too steep at its peak. So you return the knife to the wood and take 2 more hair-thin pairings that bring the angle into agreement. The test of the catch does not require measurement with a rule. Your eye knows the shape and your thumb knows the feel of the notch, and when you run your thumbnail along the sloped face, it rides smoothly without catching until it reaches the flat base, which is exactly what the spring wire must do when the trap is set. This little test, so small and quick, is performed on every catch without variation. With the shape right, you smooth the surfaces using a scrap of fine sandpaper that you tear from a larger sheet kept folded in the apron pocket. The sandpaper is a pale brown grit, worn soft from use, and you rub it gently along the catcher's face in tiny circles, the sound a low shushing that barely reaches beyond your knees. The sanding removes the faint tool marks left by the knife, and the wood takes on a dull satin gleam, the grain emerging more clearly as the surface becomes uniform. You blow the dust from the catch, a soft breath that sends a puff of fine pale powder into the shaft of window light, where it hangs and swirls for a moment before settling onto the leather. Then you hold the finished catch up to the light one last time, checking that the angle is true and the surfaces are flat, before you rise from the stool and walk to the glazed jar on the bench. You unscrew the lid, drop the catch inside with a small clink as it lands among its completed siblings, and replace the lid with the same 2-handed twist you always use. The jar is a thick glass vessel that once held preserved plums. Its sides are faintly rippled with bubbles trapped in the glass when it was blown, and the label on its front is a yellowed square of paper that reads, "Catches in your own handwriting." The letters faded to sepia. It is now about 2/3 full, the older catches at the bottom darkened and the new ones at the top still pale, but in a month they will all be the same color, and no one will know which was made first. You leave the jar on the bench and return to the stool, settling back onto the worn ash seat and spreading the leather apron across your knee again. The second offcut you pick up shows a small pin knot right at the edge where the catch's bevel will fall, and you examine it calmly, turning the piece to see if the knot extends deeper. It is only a surface blemish, a tiny dark circle no wider than a needle hole, and the beech around it is sound, so you decide to use the piece rather than discard it, because such a small flaw will not affect the catch's strength. The knife bites into the wood, and the knot chips away with a slightly different sound, a small tick rather than a whisper, and a darker crumb falls onto the leather, but the pairing that follows reveals clean wood beneath, and you shake the catch as you did the first, comparing it to the master, sanding it, blowing the dust away, and rising to drop it into the jar. This routine settles around you like a blanket, the outdoor world becoming distant and unimportant while your hands perform their small, exact work. You work through the pile of offcuts in this manner, each one taking perhaps 3 or 4 minutes, the time expanding and contracting without your notice. The light through the window shifts very slowly across the floorboards, the rectangle of silver creeping toward the leg of the stool, and the stove clicks its quiet commentary in the background. The knife never grows dull because the beech of cuts is small and the cuts are light, and you strop the blade anyway every 10 catches or so, a habit so ingrained that your hands do it while your eyes rest on the meadow outside. You rise from the stool, walk to the jar, drop the catch, return to the stool, pick up the next offcut, and each transition is made with the same unconscious grace that a bird uses when it shifts from one branch to another. After the first dozen catches, you pause to stretch your fingers, flexing them open and closed a few times, feeling the slight stiffness in the knuckles that always comes from gripping the small knife handle. You rub your palms together, the friction warming them, and you look out the window at the grey sky that has not changed its expression all day. A flat, even cloud, like a sheet of unspun wool, stretched from horizon to horizon. The apple tree stands black and still against it, its bark catching the diffuse light in a way that makes the tree look as if it is outlined in pale chalk. You watch the tree without thinking about it, simply seeing its shape as you have seen it 1,000 times, and then you turn back to the pile of offcuts, which has now shrunk by half. The leather apron has collected a fine layer of wood dust and tiny chips, and you shake it out the window with 2 sharp snaps that send the particles drifting down onto the grass below, where they vanish among the blades. The next piece you pick up is not a catch but a trigger, a slightly larger component that will sit inside the treadle slot and transfer the mouse's weight to the catch. Triggers require a different shape, a thin, flat tongue of hard beech with a small raised tab at one end, and you need fewer of them because each trap uses only 1 trigger but 2 catches to balance the spring. You have a separate small pile of trigger blanks, cut earlier from the harder portions of the deal plank, and you bring these now to the stool and begin shaping them with the same knife, though the cuts are longer and the bevels wider. The deal is softer than the beech, the knife sliding through it with even less resistance, and the shavings that lift from the blade are whiter and fluffier, like tiny feathers. You shape the trigger blank by first flattening its bottom face so it will ride smoothly in the mortise, then thinning its front edge to a gentle taper so that the slightest pressure from above will depress it. The raised tab at the rear you leave slightly proud, to be trimmed to exact height later when you fit it into a test base, and you set each finished trigger into a separate small tin that once held tea, its lid dented but still fitting snugly. The triggers go faster than the catches because they are simpler shapes with fewer critical angles, and you complete the entire pile of 20 trigger blanks while the afternoon light is still strong through the window. The tea tin fills up with the pale little tongues of deal, each one nested against the next like fish in a crate, and you press the lid down with a satisfying soft pop. Then you return to the remaining catch-off cuts, which are only 7 pieces now, a small handful that you spread on the leather apron and count by touch, your thumb moving across them like a finger over beads. You select the straightest one and begin again, the knife whispering, the shavings falling, the master pattern held up for comparison, and the afternoon moves on without any mark of its passage except the deepening of the shadows in the corners of the workshop. By the time the last catch is finished and dropped into the glazed jar, the jar is nearly full, the pale new catches lying on top of the older ones in a jumbled heap that will settle over time. You screw the lid on tightly and hold the jar up to the window, seeing the light shine through the glass and illuminate the many small shapes inside, a store of patience made visible. The jar goes back on its shelf, the tea tin of triggers beside it, and you take the leather apron from your knee and fold it carefully, hanging it back on its hook beside the window where it will wait for the next batch. The knife you wipe with an oily rag, stroke once across the leather strop, and slip into its own small leather sheath before tucking it into the apron pocket, and then you stand up from the stool with the slow unfolding of legs that have been still too long. The stool you push back against the wall, The pile of remaining offcuts you return to the box near the stove for use another day, and the fine dust on the floor around your feet you sweep into a small heap with the edge of your shoe, and then collect with a damp rag. The workshop around you is quiet, the only active sound the low murmur of the stove and the distant cheep of a sparrow somewhere near the cottage eaves, and the window now shows a sky that is beginning to soften toward evening, the grey taking on a faintly bluish tinge in the east. You stand with one hand resting on the bench, looking at the jar of catches and the tin of triggers and the tray of mortised bases, all the components of the traps accumulating like words in a long, gentle sentence that is not yet ready for its full stop. Tomorrow you will wind the wire springs, and the day after you may begin assembly, but for now the shaping is done, the knife is clean, and the quiet holds the workshop in its steady hand. The wire arrives in coiled bundles of thin steel from a mill in Warwickshire, brought by the same carrier who delivered the timber planks, and you fetch the bundle from the dry corner of the woodshed where it has been waiting under a piece of sacking since Tuesday last. The sacking is coarse and smells of jute and faintly of the frost that melted on it yesterday, and you fold it back to reveal the wire beneath, a tight spiral of steel as wide as a dinner plate and as high as your hand, each coil lying exactly against the next with no gaps. You lift the bundle by hooking 2 fingers under the innermost ring, feeling the weight of it, the way the wire resists bending until you apply enough force and then suddenly gives with a soft springiness that trembles through the metal. The wire itself is not much thicker than a darning needle, a dull silver grey with a faint bloom of dark oil from the drawing mill, and it gleams in the weak light of the woodshed doorway like a sleeping snake. You carry the bundle across the yard, the coils flexing slightly with each step, and you nudge the workshop door open with your elbow, letting the warmth from the stove spill out to meet you. Inside, you lay the coil on the bench near the window and pause to let the wire adjust to the workshop's temperature, because cold steel can be brittle and you will be bending it into tight spirals that need a certain suppleness. While the wire warms, you prepare the tools for the morning: the straightening block, the brass mandrel, the hand crank, and the small cutting pliers. The straightening block is a piece of hard maple about the length of your forearm, drilled through with a series of holes of diminishing diameter, each one lined with a polished steel bushing. You clamp it into the tail vise so that its line of holes points toward the center of the bench. The brass mandrel is a slender rod, slightly thicker than a pencil, turned smooth on the treadle lathe you keep in the corner, and it has a small cross pin at one end that slots into the crank. The crank itself is a cast iron wheel with a wooden handle mounted on a bracket that you screw to the bench edge, and it turns the mandrel with a smooth, oiled rotation that makes no sound but a low hum. You take the cutting pliers from their hook above the bench, a pair of stubby-nosed snips with jaw inserts of hardened steel, and you open and close them a few times to work the pivot, which you oiled yesterday with a drop of neatsfoot, and which now moves as silently as a thought. The wire has by now lost its coldness to the bench, and you lift the free end from the bundle, feeding it through the largest hole of the straightening block. The wire moves stiffly at first, scraping through the steel bushing with a faint zing that sets your teeth on edge only for a moment, because you know the sound will soften once the oil from the wire coats the bushing. You pull a long length free about the span of both arms, and then you thread it through the next smaller hole, pulling again, feeling the wire straighten under the progressive constraint of the reducing diameters. The third hole takes a little more effort, your hand gripping the wire with a square of leather folded over it to protect your palm, and you draw it through with a steady pull that brings the wire out straight and true, the factory coil memory erased by the passage through the block. You measure the first length against a story stick that is notched at the exact length needed for one spring, and you snip it with the pliers, the jaws closing with a crisp click, and the cut end pinging away to land somewhere on the floor among the sawdust. The first straightened wire drops onto the bench, and you draw another length, and another, until you have a pile of straight steel wires, each one identical in length to its neighbor, lying in a silvery sheaf. With a small supply of straight wires ready, you turn to the mandrel and crank assembly, seating the brass rod into its bracket and tightening the small thumb screw that holds it steady. The mandrel now extends horizontally over the bench, and you apply a single drop of oil from a quill feeder to its polished surface, spreading it with the fingertip until a thin, even film coats the brass from the chuck to the free end. This oil will keep the coiled spring from binding on the mandrel once it is wound, allowing you to slide it off with a gentle twist. You pick up the first straight wire, bending a tiny hook at one end with the tips of the pliers, a neat right-angle turn that will catch the cross pin of the mandrel and hold the wire in place while you wind. The hook is no longer than a grain of barley, and you form it with a single squeeze and roll of the wrist, the pliers giving a soft clink. You slide the hooked end over the cross pin, and then position the straight wire along the mandrel, pressing it flat against the brass with your left thumb, while your right hand takes hold of the wooden crank handle. The first turn is always the slowest, a cautious rotation that brings the wire around the mandrel in close contact, the steel bending with a slight resistance that yields to a smooth curve. The crank moves a full circle, and you watch the wire follow, wrapping tight against the mandrel with a tiny creak. You turn again and again, the wire feeding onto the mandrel in a helix of diminishing diameter, each turn pushing against the previous one, so that the coils nest together without gaps. The motion of the crank is steady, a rotation that uses your whole forearm and not just your wrist, and you settle into a rhythm after the first 6 turns, the crank handle describing a small circle in the air again and again. The wire now coils along the mandrel like a silver thread winding onto a spool, the space between coils measured not by sight, but by the pressure of your thumb, which keeps the wire from riding up over itself. The length of the wire is such that when you have wound exactly 14 turns, the tail end is just long enough to cut, a distance you know by feel, because the story stick measured it before you began. You release the crank and take up the pliers, snipping the tail end of the wire to leave a clean straight stub that will form the anchor leg of the spring, the part that hooks into the notch you cut on the underside of the trap base. The snip is quick, the small bite of the steel, and the loose coil on the mandrel remains in place, its ends captured between your thumb and the brass. Now you slide the crank backward an eighth of a turn to release the tension slightly, and you grip the coil with your leather-padded fingers to twist it gently off the mandrel. The spring slides free with a smooth release, the oil doing its quiet work, and you hold it up between your forefinger and thumb to observe the evenness of the coils, the straightness of the anchor leg, and the clean cut of the tail. This first spring you test immediately, compressing it between your right thumb and forefinger, pushing the coils together with a steady force that you have applied to many thousands of springs before. The resistance is firm and even, the spring closing smoothly without any sudden buckling. And when you release the pressure, it opens again with a soft ping, the coils separating to their original spacing as though they remember perfectly where they belong. The test takes maybe 3 seconds, and since the spring shows no sign of taking a set or twisting sideways, you lay it in a shallow wooden box lined with a scrap of wool cloth, the first of a new batch. The second wire is already waiting, and you hook it onto the mandrel, press it flat, and turn the crank through 14 turns, the motion now finding a comfortable cadence that your body recognizes from all the mornings you have spent at this exact task. The sound of the turning crank is a low, oiled rotation, a sound that you feel more in the handle than you hear in the air, and it blends with the soft rush of the stove and the distant murmur of wind in the chimney to form a texture of quiet that belongs only to this hour. The springs accumulate in their wooden box one after another, each making a tiny glassy clink as it lands among its fellows, and the pile of straight wires diminishes by gradual degrees. You pause after every 5th spring to wipe the mandrel with a rag and apply a fresh drop of oil, a small ritual that prevents any roughness from developing on the brass. And then you resume the turning with the same unhurried motion, your mind drifting across the room to the window where the grey sky has lightened a fraction as the morning climbs toward noon. The coil of wire from Warwickshire was wound at the mill by a machine you have never seen, a device of gears and cams that draws the steel through progressive dies until it reaches the gauge you specified in your order letter, a thickness that the wire drawer calls number 22. The wire comes to you annealed, softened in a furnace so that it can be bent and coiled without fracturing, but the act of winding it around your mandrel cold works the steel just enough to give the springs their necessary stiffness, a property that you understand through your hands, if not through the words of a metallurgist. You have learned over the years that on damped days the wire is slightly more prone to surface rust if left untended, And so you keep a small tin of beeswax dissolved in turpentine on the shelf above the bench, and as you finish each group of 10 springs, you wipe them with a rag dipped in this mixture, a thin coating that will darken the steel to a dull brown grey and protect it during the weeks it will spend in the granary. The wax smells of honey and pine, and it mingles with the other workshop scents, until the air itself seems to carry the memory of a forest. The spring making continues through the middle of the day, the light from the window shifting across the bench until it falls directly on the mandrel and makes the polished brass gleam like a band of sunlight. You do not stop for a meal. You ate well earlier, and the work is not tiring in a way that demands rest, so you simply continue turning the crank, hooking the wires, snipping the tails, testing the resistance, and treating the finished springs with the wax mixture. Your hands grow slightly grey from the steel, a fine metallic dust mixing with the oil to form a patina that darkens the creases of your knuckles, and you scrub them absent-mindedly on the canvas apron from time to time, a gesture that does little to clean them but satisfies some small need for order. The box of finished springs now holds perhaps 40 of the little coils, arranged in neat rows that you straighten with a fingertip, and the pile of straight wires is down to its last dozen lengths, a small handful that you count by eye and note with a brief, calm satisfaction. The last few wires you wind with the same care as the first, because the quality of the final springs depends on consistency across the entire batch, and you have found that your hands grow sloppy only if your mind is elsewhere, which today it is not. Your mind stays here in the workshop, loosely tethered to the crank and the mandrel, occasionally wandering to the granary that will receive these traps, or to the next batch of timber that should arrive before the week is out, but always returning gently to the work, like a dog that circles and then lies down again. When the last wire is wound, snipped, tested, and waxed, you slide the mandrel from its bracket and wipe it clean with a soft rag. Then you set the crank back on its shelf and coil the remaining short ends of wire into a small metal pail that you keep for scrap. The scrap pail is nearly full, and you make a note in the back of your mind that you will walk it to the smith in the village when the weather clears, a journey you make every few months and which the smith rewards with a small discount on the next bundle of wire, an arrangement that is continued without a written agreement for over a decade. Now you sit back on the three-legged stool and give your arms a rest, the muscles of your forearms feeling lightly warm from the sustained turning, a sensation that is not unpleasant and that will fade by the time you have taken a cup of tea. You pour yourself a dipper of water and drink it, looking out the window at the meadow that remains unchanged under its grey lid of cloud. The sheep now huddled near the fold, the hawthorn hedge a dark scribble across the field's edge. A light rain has begun to fall, so fine that it is more a mist than a rain, and it beads on the outside of the window glass in tiny silver dots that slowly merge and run downward. The sound of the rain on the thatch above is a soft mutter, 1,000 tiny taps that blend into a single low hiss, and it adds a new layer of quiet to the workshop, muffling the outside world even further. The stove ticks, the lamp burns steadily, and the box of springs sits on the bench with its rows of neat coils, each one ready for assembly. You rise from the stool and walk to the shelf where the tray of bases waits under its linen cloth, lifting a corner to confirm that all the notches and mortises are still clean and free of dust. Then you bring the box of springs over and set it beside the tray, the two components now facing each other like neighbors who will soon be introduced. The catches and triggers in their jar and tin stand ready on the shelf above, and the whole set of parts looks complete, the entire trap ready to come together in the next phase of work. But assembly you will save for later, when the light is lower and the oil lamp becomes the main source of illumination, because the fine work of setting springs and catches requires a close brightness that the grey afternoon does not yet provide. For now you are content to have the springs made, the steel transformed from a coarse coil from a mill into orderly, even spirals that carry the potential energy of a snap that will one day be released in a dark granary far away. The snap itself you will test many times during assembly, but each test is simply a release of stored force, a tiny event that will occur and then be reset, over and over, until the traps are packed and sent. There is no urgency in any of it, only the steady accumulation of small tasks that will lead without drama to the crates being full and the carrier arriving at the gate. You clean your hands with a rag and scrub them more thoroughly at the water pail, working the grey patina from the creases with a nail brush of stiff bristle until your fingers return to their ordinary colour. The water in the pail swirls with a faint metallic cloud, and you pour it out the back door onto the roots of the apple tree, where the rain is already darkening the soil in spreading circles. The rain has thickened now, a proper drizzle that patters on the leaves of the holly bush and drips from the thatch in a rhythmic series of heavy drops, each one landing on the stone step with a plink. You stand in the doorway for a moment, breathing the cool, wet air that smells of turned earth and rain-soaked moss, and then you step back inside and close the door, shutting the weather out. The workshop enfolds you again, warm and dry, the stove muttering to itself, the lamp glowing, the springs coiled and ready in their box, and the afternoon stretching ahead with no demands beyond the quiet company of the tools and the wood. The afternoon fades without announcement, the grey light through the window thinning into a cooler, bluer shade that seeps away so gradually you hardly notice it until the corners of the workshop begin to gather shadows. You stop at the stove to add a fresh log, the iron door opening with a soft creak and the embers flaring briefly orange as new air reaches them. And then you turn to the oil lamp on its hook above the bench, lifting the glass chimney carefully to touch a splint of deal to the wick. The flame catches with a small yellow leap and then settles into its steady teardrop shape, and you lower the chimney, watching the light spread outward to claim the bench, the tools, the tray of bases, the box of springs. The lamp has a companion now, because you cross the room to the shelf where 2 tallow candles in tin holders wait for evenings such as this, and you light each one from the lamp's flame, carrying them to the bench with a cupped hand, sheltering the wicks until they burn evenly. You set one candle at the left end of the bench and the other at the right, their flames reflected in the polished surface of the oiled wood, and the workshop becomes a small island of warm light floating in the general dusk. The window has turned black, a dark rectangle that shows only the ghostly reflection of the candles doubled by the glass, and beyond it the rain continues to fall in a steady whisper against the thatch. You draw the stool close to the bench and sit down, the arrangement of parts already laid out in the order you will need them. Nearest to your right hand sits the tray of mortised bases, each one already notched on its underside for the spring anchor. Beside the tray is the shallow wooden box of coiled springs, their rows neat and their steel darkened to a soft brown grey by the wax mixture you applied earlier. To the left of the springs stand the glazed jar of catches and the tea tin of triggers, their lids already loosened, and beside them is a small dish containing a dozen tiny brass screws, each one no longer than a grain of rice, which you will use only if a catch needs an extra degree of security, though most will stay firm in their slots by friction alone. A thin-bladed screwdriver with a beechwood handle lies across the dish, its tip ground to fit the slot of the screws precisely, and next to it rests the testing dowel, a simple length of dowel rod about the thickness of your little finger, rounded at one end to mimic the pressure of a small foot. These objects sit on the bench with the calm expectancy of things that know their purpose, and you look at them for a moment without any hurry to begin, letting the warmth of the stove settle around your shoulders and the candlelight steady into its quiet glow. The first base you take from the tray has a mortise that you cut early in the day, its walls clean and its floor flat, catching the candlelight as a small shadowed pool. You turn it over so the underside faces up, the anchor notch a tiny square pocket near the center, and you select a spring from the box, handling it with your thumb and forefinger so that the coils are not compressed before their time. The spring's anchor leg, that short straight stub you cut from the tail of the wire after winding, slots into the notch with a gentle push, the steel sliding against the beech with a faint hiss until it seats firmly at the bottom. You press the coil flat against the base, the spring compressing slightly and then returning, and you confirm that the anchor holds without lifting when you tug it lightly with your fingernail. The spring now lies along the base, its coil positioned so that the bail arm, a longer straight length of wire that extends from the opposite end of the coil, will later sweep across the trap when released. You turn the base right side up and set it flat on the bench, the spring now concealed beneath except for its bail arm and the small tensioning loop that protrudes through a narrow channel you have yet to cut, though on this design the channel is simply the gap between the treadle and the base edge. From the glazed jar you take a catch, the pale beech piece you whittle to its precise angle, and you press it into its slot at the end of the treadle mortise, seating it with your thumb until it clicks softly against the wood. The catch leans at its shallow angle, its sloped face pointing toward the spring, and you test its security by nudging it sideways with the tip of the screwdriver. It does not budge, so no screw is needed, and you leave the little brass fasteners untouched in their dish. The trigger comes next, the thin deal tongue that you shaped on the stool by the window, and you slide it into the treadle mortise so that its front end rides just above the catch, the two pieces separated by a gap, no thicker than a playing card. The trigger settles into place with a slight rattle, and you press its rear tab down gently to see that it rocks freely against the catch below. Now comes the moment of setting the spring, an act you've performed so many times that your fingers move through it before your mind can narrate the steps. You take the bail arm between your right thumb and forefinger and pull it back against the coil's resistance, the steel bending with a smooth, firm pressure that travels up your arm as a quiet hum of force. The bail sweeps across the base in an arc toward the catch, and you guide its end into the notch of the catch with the nail of your left thumb, pressing down until the wire snaps into the slot with a soft snick. The trap is now set, the spring held under tension by the tiny angled piece of beech, the bail arm poised and waiting. You lift your hands away carefully and nothing moves. The catch holds. The spring breathes its stored energy silently. The trigger lies flat in its mortise. The whole assembly has taken perhaps 40 seconds, and you examine it in the candlelight with a quiet attention that is not anxiety, but simply the habit of checking work well done. The testing dowel you now take in your right hand, its rounded end aimed at the center of the treadle, and you press down with a slow, gentle force that mimics the weight of a very small creature. The treadle dips, the trigger rocks, and the catch releases the bail arm with a clean, sharp smick of wire snapping forward, the bail flying across the base to land with a muffled tap against the far edge. The spring has done its work exactly as it should, and you reset it immediately, pulling the bail back and hooking it onto the catch again, feeling the same smooth tension, hearing the same small snick as the catch engages. You test the trap 3 times in total, each test identical in its mechanics, but never quite the same in the tiny details of sound, because the wood of the base transmits the vibration slightly differently depending on how the candle flame happens to flicker at that moment. The first base passes all tests, and you set it aside on a fresh wooden tray that you have brought specifically for finished traps, placing it at the far left corner where it will be the first of a new row. The second base you lift from the tray of mortised blanks, and you go through the entire sequence again. Insert the spring anchor into its notch, check the anchor's hold, turn the base, fit the catch into its slot, slide the trigger into the mortise, pull back the bail arm, hook it onto the catch, test with the dowel 1, 2, 3 times, and then set the finished trap beside the first. The candle flames bend slightly as you move, then straighten again when you are still, and the shadows on the wall behind the bench mimic your movements in a slower, softer version that seems to have a life of its own. The stove ticks quietly as a log shifts, and the rain outside continues its steady murmur against the glass, a sound so constant that you have stopped noticing it except as a kind of silence. The third trap, the fourth, the fifth, each one assembled with the same patient economy of motion, the parts coming together like the closing of a familiar book. You discover that one catch does not seat quite firmly enough, and rocks a fraction when you nudge it, so you take one of the tiny brass screws from the dish and drive it into a pilot hole you make with an awl, 2 twists of the wrist that secure the catch without splitting the wood, and the trap then functions perfectly. Another base has a slightly tight mortise that makes the trigger stick, and you ease the slot with a single paring stroke of the narrow chisel, a 10-second correction that restores the fit, after which the trigger rocks freely and the trap tests true. These small adjustments are not interruptions but simply variations in the texture of the work, like the occasional knot in a length of thread, and you make them without irritation or hurry. The row of finished traps on the tray grows longer as the evening deepens, the new wood at the bases glowing a warm honey color in the candlelight, the dark steel of the springs and bails creating a quiet contrast of silver-brown against the pale beech. You pause now and again to straighten the row, nudging each trap so that its edges align with its neighbor, a small habit that serves no mechanical purpose but pleases some orderly corner of your mind. The tea tin of triggers grows emptier, the jar of catches shows more glass than wood when you tilt it, and the box of springs is now more than half depleted, its wall lining showing through in pale tufts. The whole batch is moving toward completion, with the slow inevitability of Sam through an hourglass, each trap a grain. As you work, your shadow falls across the bench from the lamp behind you, a broad, dark shape that floats over the tools and the wood without ever quite touching them, because the candles on either side fill in the silhouette from the edges. The shadow moves when you move and stills when you still, a silent companion that has kept you company through many such evenings. The workshop beyond the circle of light has become very dark now. The corners retreated into deep brown black, the rafters lost in shadow, the window a sheet of polished obsidian that reflects the two candles and nothing more. The room feels smaller and closer at this hour, not in a way that confines but in a way that enfolds, like a heavy blanket tucked around the shoulders, and the warmth of the stove is a steady presence at your back. You complete the 20th trap of the evening and set it on the tray, then lean back on the stool to stretch your spine, pressing your palms against the small of your back and arching slightly until the muscles ease. The clock on the cottage wall, if you had one, would be striking some late hour, but you have never kept a clock in the workshop, preferring to let the work measure its own time. You know only that the rain has slowed to a drizzle, the drops on the glass now falling less frequently, each one catching the candlelight for an instant before sliding into the dark. You rise from the stool and walk to the stove, opening its door to bank the coals with the poker, pushing the glowing embers into a neat mound that will hold its warmth until morning. A fresh log you add from the basket, settling it across the embers where it will catch slowly, and then you close the iron door and listen to the soft tick of expanding metal. The remaining components sit on the bench waiting for tomorrow, and you cover the tray of unfinished bases with the linen cloth, the same blue-striped fabric that has covered them before. The box of springs you close with its wooden lid, and the jar of catches you seal with its glass stopper, the tea tin of triggers following with its dented lid pressed down. The little dish of brass screws you move to the back of the bench against the wall, where it will be safe from being knocked, and the testing dowel you return to the jar of spare dowels that stands on the windowsill. Each tool is wiped and hung or set in its proper place. The screwdriver back in its slot in the rack, the awl in the drawer, the oil rag folded once and laid across the corner of the bench. The work of tidying is as much a part of the assembly as the setting of the springs, the closing note in a phrase of labor, and you perform it with the same calm attention. You stand for a moment with one hand resting on the tray of finished traps, looking at the neat row of 20 assembled mechanisms, each one primed and ready to be packed in straw. The candlelight flickers across the bales as a slight draft moves through the room, perhaps from the door settling, and the wires gleam once, and then are still. The catches hold, the springs wait, the treadles lie flat, and the whole assembly seems to be in a state of patient suspension, a small population of quiet purpose. You lift one of the traps and turn it over, examining the underside where the spring anchor hides in its notch, and then you set it back, aligning it with the others. There is nothing more to do tonight. You cup your hand behind the nearer candle flame and blow gently, extinguishing it with a thin trail of smoke that rises to join the general haze near the ceiling. The second candle follows, then the lamp, each flame snuffed with a soft breath and a slight smell of hot tallow that mingles with the other workshop scents. The room falls into darkness except for the faint orange glow that escapes through the stove's air grate, a tiny pattern of light on the stone floor. You feel your way to the inner door with the ease of long familiarity, your hand finding the wooden latch without searching, and you step through into the cottage passageway, closing the door behind you. The workshop settles into silence, the finished traps standing in their row under the dark, the springs coiled, the catches set, all of it waiting for the packing and the cart and the granary, while the rain outside dwindles to a single occasional drip and the night wraps the cottage in its deep, slow breathing. The morning that follows the assembly is dry and still, the rain of the night before having passed on eastward toward the Chilterns and left behind a sky of soft pearl that lets through a light so even and diffuse that shadows barely form on the workshop floor. You open the shutter and the window together, letting in the cool, washed air that smells of wet grass and clean stone, and you stand for a moment with your hands on the sill, looking out at the meadow where the sheep have spread across the field again. Now that the rain has stopped, the puddles on the lane reflect the pale sky in flat silver discs, and the hawthorn hedge drips slowly, each drop falling from the twigs with a tiny flash of light. The air inside the workshop, which had grown close with candle smoke and the warmth of the stove, begins to freshen and move, the draft carrying away the tallow smell and replacing it with the green scent of the morning. You breathe it in deeply once, and then turn to the bench where the tray of finished traps has waited through the night, their bales gleaming dully under the linen cloth you left over them. Today is a packing day, a slower and quieter day than those of cutting and planing, because the making is done and only the preparing for the journey remains. You go to the small store cupboard at the back of the workshop, a narrow closet built into the thickness of the cottage wall, and you open its plank door to bring out the materials that you keep for this purpose. The straw comes first, a bundle of clean, dry wheat straw that you gathered from the threshing floor at the mill last autumn and bound with twine. It has been stored high in the cupboard where the damp cannot reach it, and it rustles when you lift it, a dry, papery sound like a mouse moving through leaves. The bundle is as long as your arm and as thick as your thigh, pale gold in color with a faint, sweet smell of sun and grain. You carry it to the bench and lay it down, untying the twine and spreading the stalks across the oiled wood so that they form a loose mat. Then you fetch the pine crates, which you stacked against the back wall weeks ago after the carpenter in the village delivered them, and you bring 2 of them forward, setting them on the floor beside the bench where they will be easy to fill. The crates are simple boxes of deal, nailed together with small iron nails and left unplaned on the outside, though the insides have been smoothed so that no splinter will catch the straw or the traps. Each crate has a sliding lid that fits into grooves cut along the top edges, and you slide one lid open now to check that the interior is clean and dry, which it is, smelling faintly of resin and fresh wood. You place the first crate on the bench beside the straw, positioning it so that its open top faces you like a small square mouth waiting to be fed. The tray of finished traps you slide closer, and you lift the linen cloth away, folding it and setting it on the windowsill where the pale sun that is now beginning to break through can warm the fabric. The traps lie in their neat row, 40 in total counting those you assembled yesterday and those you finished in the hour after supper. A full batch for one crate, and you allow yourself a single look at the completed work before you begin to hide each trap in its nest of straw. The packing itself is a gentle, repetitive process that has its own small sequence. You take a trap from the tray with your left hand, holding it by the base so that the bale is not disturbed, and you lay it on the spread of straw. With your right hand you gather a handful of stalks, perhaps 20 or 30, and you fold them around the trap from below and above, covering the mechanism completely so that no wood or steel touches the crate or its neighbor. The straw crinkles softly as you fold it, the sound a continuous low rustle that fills the space around your hands, and you turn the bundle over once to tuck in the loose ends before lowering it into the crate. The first trap settles into the bottom corner with a soft thud, the straw compressing slightly against the deal, and you press it down with 2 fingers, not hard, just enough to make a level bed for the next bundle. The second trap you wrap and place beside the first, the 2 bundles fitting snugly without gaps, and the third you lay across the ends of the first 2, beginning a second layer that will fill the crate in a pattern you have used for years, a simple cross-hatching that prevents the traps from shifting in transit. Each bundle is roughly the same size, though no 2 are identical, because the straw varies in thickness and the traps settle into their wrappings with slight differences in shape, and your hands adjust to these small variations without any need for measurement or comparison. The work of wrapping and placing continues with a quiet rhythm, your hands moving between the tray and the straw and the crate in a circular motion that repeats every 20 seconds or so. The straw rustles, the traps click softly against each other inside their wrappings, your feet shift on the stone floor, and beyond these small sounds, the workshop is still. The stove has burned low since you did not add a fresh log after opening the window, and its heat is now a gentle background rather than an active presence, just enough to keep the air dry for the straw. The light through the window has strengthened, the sun finally breaking through the pearl cloud to cast a pale yellow glow across the bench, and the straw catches this light and glows golden, its dry stalks translucent at the edges, the tiny feathery heads of the wheat that still cling to some stems, casting thread-like shadows on the wood. When the first layer is complete and the bottom of the crate is hidden under a neat grid of straw bundles, you pause to brush the loose chaff from your apron, a scattering of golden dust and tiny broken stem pieces that float down to the floor. The tray of traps is still half full, the second row of finished mechanisms waiting their turn, and you take up the next trap and begin a new layer. The packing is so undemanding that your mind is free to drift across the room and out the window, noticing that the blackbird has returned to the grass and is pulling at a worm with sharp little tugs of its yellow beak, or that the puddles on the lane have shrunk since you last looked, their silver discs now ringed with dry stone. These observations come and go like the slow passage of clouds, leaving no mark on the steady work of your hands. The crate fills from the bottom upward, the layers building until the last trap must be pressed gently into the top corner, the straw compressing under your palm to make a flat surface level with the rim. You take a final handful of straw and spread it across the top as a cushion before sliding the lid into its grooves, the deal plank fitting with a soft scrape, and then you tap the lid home with the heel of your hand until it seats flush. The crate is now a self-contained world, the 40 traps hidden inside their straw nests, invisible and protected, and you turn the crate around to face the light so that you can label it. From a drawer under the bench, you take a stub of carpenter's pencil, blunt and soft, and you write on the rough deal of the lid, in neat upright letters, Thames, Street Granary, London. Below this, you add the date, the number of traps, and your own mark, a small circle with a cross inside it that the warehouseman has learned to recognize over the years. The pencil scratches quietly across the grain, leaving a dark silver trace that will survive the journey, and then you put the pencil away and slide the labeled crate to the far end of the bench. The second crate you lift onto the bench, its empty hollow waiting, and you spread fresh straw from the bundle, which is now reduced to a loose pile about half its original size. The second tray of finished traps, the additional 40 that will complete the granary order, sits on the shelf behind you, and you bring it down and set it where the first tray had been. The traps identical in every way to those already packed, each one tested and set and ready. The wrapping resumes, the straw folding around each trap in its soft embrace, the bundles lowering into the crate one after another, the pattern of cross-hatching repeating without the need for thought. Your hands have grown slightly dry from the straw, the skin of your palms feeling papery, and you pause to rub a drop of linseed oil into them, working it across the knuckles and into the creases before wiping the excess on your apron and returning to the work. The oil leaves a faint sheen on the straw where you next touch it, a small dark patch that will dry invisibly. As the second crate fills, you notice that the sun has moved across the bench and now lights the far wall, illuminating the tools on their hooks so that they cast elongated shadows downward like the rungs of a ladder. The planing iron gleams, the saw-teeth catch the light as a jagged line, the brass fittings on the marking gauge glow with a soft, warm patina, and the whole wall seems like a display not of tools, but of the idea of tools, a quiet museum of the everyday. You look at this wall for a moment without stopping the movement of your hands, and then you return your gaze to the crate, where only 3 traps remain to be packed. These last 3 traps you wrap with particular care, taking the longest and most flexible straws from the remaining pile, bending them gently around the bales so that the wire is padded on all sides. The final trap of the order, the 80th, is no different from the first you ever made, yet you hold it for a fraction longer before lowering it into its place, and you press the straw down around it with a deliberate softness, as if tucking a blanket around something sleeping. The last handful of straw spreads across the top, the lid slides into its grooves. The pencil writes the same address and the same date and the same small circle with a cross, and then the second crate stands beside the first on the bench, 2 sturdy boxes of pale deal marked with the destination that will carry these traps away from the cottage forever. You brush down your apron and shake the straw dust from your sleeves, walking to the door to step outside for a breath of fresh air. The morning has grown quite bright now, the sun a full white coin behind a thinning veil of high cloud, and the meadow steams gently as the moisture from yesterday's rain evaporates. The apple tree by the gate has tiny buds forming on its twigs, hard green points that will become leaves in a few weeks, and you notice them with the mild pleasure of seeing a familiar sign that spring is not far off. The crates inside will travel through the tail end of winter, but by the time they reach London, the first crocuses may be showing in the squares, a fact that you have no way of knowing and no need to know. You simply stand in the doorway and feel the cool air on your face, and then you return inside where the stove still glows softly. The slate that hangs by the door, a rectangular piece of roofing slate framed in beechwood, carries the tally of your deliveries, and you take it down now to add the new numbers. The white chalk stick rests in a little groove at the bottom of the frame, and you pick it up and write 80 in neat figures beneath the previous entry, the chalk squeaking softly against the dark stone. You add the date in smaller numerals, then the name of the granary in abbreviated form, and you hang the slate back on its nail with the chalk stick replaced in its groove. The column of figures on the slate stretches back through several months, a record of quiet, regular work that has never been interrupted by anything more dramatic than a late timber delivery or a week of cold so bitter that the glue pot froze. The numbers look small and neat, each one a week of labor reduced to a few strokes of chalk, and they please you with their orderliness. Now you prepare the crates for the carrier's arrival, which you expect sometime in the afternoon. You take a length of thin rope from the store cupboard, the same rope you have used for many deliveries, its fibers soft and dark from handling, and you tie a simple loop around each crate, one loop lengthways and one crossways, to give the carrier something to grip when he lifts them onto the cart. The knots are a bowline at each crossing, a knot you could tie in your sleep, and you tighten them with a steady pull that compresses the straw inside another fraction. You then spread a piece of oilcloth over the two crates where they sit on the bench, the same oilcloth that covered the planks outside earlier in the week, and you tuck its edges under the bottom corners to keep any dust or damp from reaching the wood before the carrier arrives. The oilcloth is dark brown and smells of linseed, and it rustles stiffly as you handle it, a sound that belongs to endings and departures. The workshop now feels settled, the work complete, the crates sealed and ready. You wash your hands at the water pail, using the yellow soap to scrub away the last traces of straw dust and the grey residue of the pencil lead, and you dry them on the coarse linen cloth that hangs from a peg. The tools on the wall catch your eye, and you note that they will need a proper cleaning and oiling before the next batch begins, but that is a task for tomorrow or the day after, not for now. For now it is enough that the traps are made, packed and tallied, and that the granary on Thames Street will soon receive 80 new traps to add to their stores. The thought drifts across your mind without any particular weight, and you let it drift away again, turning your attention to the small hunger that has begun to make itself known. A quiet signal that it is time for the midday meal. You close the workshop window but leave the shutter open so that some light continues to fall across the crates, and you bank the stove with a final log, pushing the damper nearly closed so that the fire will doze while you are gone. At the door you pause and look back at the two crates sitting under their oilcloth, the bundled straw visible at the edges, the addresses facing toward the lane. They are ready to leave, and you are ready to let them go, and the quiet of the workshop behind you seems to hold its breath in the same patient waiting. You step through the inner door into the cottage passageway, pulling it shut with a soft click, and the smell of baking bread from the kitchen reaches you again, warm and yeasty, a welcome that has greeted you at the end of every packing day for as long as you can remember. The carrier's cart arrives a little after the midday hour, its iron-rimmed wheels grinding softly against the flint of the lane before you see it round the bend by the hawthorn hedge. You hear it first as a low rumble that might be distant thunder, except that the sky holds no threat of a storm, and then the sound clarifies into the familiar rhythm of a heavy cart on packed earth, the creak of ashwood side rails, and the occasional jingle of the horse's harness brass. You have been waiting in the workshop doorway with your coat buttoned and your boots on, the two crates already carried out to the gate and set on the flat coping stones of the wall, where the carrier can load them without needing to enter the yard. The oilcloth still wraps each crate, its edges tucked under the rope bindings, and the morning sun has dried the last traces of damp from the surface of the rope so that it feels warm and slightly fuzzy to the touch. You step to the gate and open it, swinging it wide on its leather hinges, and you stand in the lane with one hand resting on the top bar, watching the cart approach. The carrier is a man named Hal, a broad-shouldered fellow in a felt hat and a heavy wool coat the color of wet slate, who has driven this lane twice a week for more years than either of you would bother to count. He sits on a plank seat at the front of the cart with the reins loose in his left hand, and his horse is a steady, dappled grey mare, with a white blaze down her face and feathered fetlocks that are muddy from the journey out. The horse walks with a slow, even plod, her head nodding in time with her stride, and the cart sways gently behind her like a boat on a calm river. Hal raises a hand in greeting as he draws near, and you raise yours in return, the gesture so familiar that it passes between you without any need for words. The cart pulls up alongside the gate, the horse stopping without a command because she knows this stopping place as well as she knows her own stable, and Hal sets the brake with a few turns of a wooden lever before climbing down to the lane. The two of you exchange a few words about the weather, the state of the road, and the delivery that Hal has just made to the mill upstream. Nothing more than the small currency of acquaintance, and then Hal walks to the wall and examines the crates with a practiced eye. He lifts one end of the first crate to feel its weight, testing the balance, and he nods at the neatness of the rope bindings, the clarity of the address you have written on the lid. You hold the gate while he carries the first crate to the cart, walking with the slow, careful steps of a man who knows that haste is the enemy of a sound back. And he slides the crate into the bed of the cart where it joins several other parcels bound for London. A bolt of woolen cloth from the mill, a small cask of honey from the apiary at Littlehampton, a crate of earthenware jars packed in straw, much like your own. The second crate follows the first, Hal settling it against the forward board where the motion of the cart will not jostle it, and he braces both crates with a length of woven webbing that he hooks to the side rails and tightens with a wooden toggle. When he is satisfied that the load will not shift, he wipes his hands on a rag tucked into his belt and turns back to you. You walk with Hal to the front of the cart and offer him a dipper of water from the pail you keep by the gate, and he drinks it in 3 long swallows, while the grey mare stands patient and still, her breath steaming faintly in the cool air. You pat the horse's neck, feeling the warmth of her coat under your palm and the rough texture of her winter hair, and she flicks an ear towards you without turning her head. Then Hal climbs back onto his seat, settles the reins into his hands, and releases the brake with a shove of his boot. The cart moves forward with a low groan of wood and iron, the wheels beginning their slow revolution, and Hal flicks a 2-fingered salute in your direction before turning his attention to the lane ahead. You close the gate behind the cart and stand there leaning on it, watching the vehicle shrink along the hedgerow, the grey mare's tail swishing gently, the brass fittings on her harness catching the pale sun in small bright winks that flash and then are gone. The lane curves eastward around the meadow and the cart disappears behind the oak tree near the sheepfold, but you can still hear the wheels for a long while after, a grumble that fades very gradually into the distance, until it is indistinguishable from the sigh of the light wind in the hawthorn. You return to the workshop, but only for long enough to close the shutter and snuff the lamp that has been burning low all morning, its flame now a weak blue ghost that dies with a thread of smoke. The stove you leave banked, the damper nearly shut, because you will not be gone more than a few hours, and the room will hold its warmth until you return. You take your coat from its hook by the inner door, a sturdy garment of brown wool lined with a thin layer of cotton batting, and you button it up to your throat. Your hat, a brimmed felt of a darker brown, you take from the shelf above the door and settle onto your head, pulling the brim down just enough to shade your eyes from the pale glare of the sky. You are not needed on the cart journey to London, but you go along on these deliveries when the order is large enough to warrant an extra pair of hands at the wharf, and besides, the ride is a quiet change from the confines of the workshop, a slow passage through country that you have watched through the window but seldom walk through. You close the workshop door behind you, test the latch with a firm press, and then walk around the cottage to the lane where the cart has already travelled ahead. Hal waits for you at the first crossroads. The cart pulled onto the grassy verge, where a fingerpost of weathered oak points its 4 arms toward the villages and the city beyond. You catch up at a steady walk, your boots finding the drier ruts along the edge of the lane, and the grey mare greets you with a soft blow through her nostrils before you climb onto the cart bed and settle yourself against the forward board, your back resting against the webbing that holds the crates. The cargo around you smells of wool, honey, fired clay, and the clean dry scent of your own packed straw, a mixed perfume that changes as the cart sways, and you find a comfortable position with your legs stretched out and your hands folded across your stomach. Hal chirps to the mare and she leans into her collar, the cart lurching gently once, and then rolling smoothly onto the packed gravel of the turnpike road. The journey to the Thames wharves takes the cart along a series of lanes that Hal knows by heart, a route he has followed since he was a young man working for his father's cottage business, and he drives without hesitation, turning the mare left at the old boundary stone, right at the bridge over the chalk stream, straight through the hamlet of West End Green, where the geese scatter from the verge with a honking flutter. The lanes are narrow, lined with bare hedgerows that show the first tiny buds of the coming spring, tight green nubs on the hawthorn and elder, and the fields beyond are winter brown still, ploughed into neat ridges that run away to the horizon in parallel lines. The sky remains a soft pearl, the sun a bright smear behind the high cloud, and the light that falls across the landscape is gentle and without shadows, so that every tree and hedge and distant farmhouse seems to be drawn in pencil rather than painted. The cart creaks, a low musical sound that changes pitch when the wheels cross a patch of rougher ground, and the harness jingles with each step of the mare, a high tinny ring of brass on brass that blends with the lower notes of the wheel hubs and the soft thud of hooves on packed earth. These sounds together form a gentle music that requires no listener, and they soon fade from your attention so that you hear them only as a kind of silence, a background texture against which your thoughts can drift. The journey continues, the cart rounding the shoulder of the chalk hill where the road cuts through a band of white rock that gleams wetly in the shade, then descending into the valley where the first outlying cottages of the western villages begin to appear, their thatched roofs grey with age, and their kitchen gardens neat rectangles of turned soil. Hal does not speak much, which suits you, and you do not speak either, which suits him. The two of you share the quiet in a way that requires no conversation, each occupied with the small task of letting the journey pass. Now and again Hal will murmur something to the mare, a low word of encouragement or a gentle chide, and she will flick an ear and continue her steady plod. You watch the landscape change slowly from open fields to hedged enclosures, from isolated farms to clusters of cottages, from the deep quiet of the country to the shallower quiet of the villages where the sound of a smith's hammer rings distantly, or a woman calls to her children across a yard. The villages pass one by one, their names painted on signboards at the edges. Chalfont St. Peter, with its flint church tower. Ickenham, where a water wheel turns slowly in the mill race. Hayes, where an innkeeper stands in his doorway watching the cart go by. Each village is slightly larger than the last, the gaps between them slightly shorter, and you feel the gradual accumulation of population like a slow tide rising around you. By the middle of the afternoon, the cart has reached the outer edge of London, a threshold that is marked not by a sign or a gate, but by a thickening of the road and a change in the air. The lanes give way to wider streets paved with cobblestones, and the iron tires of the cart wheels begin to ring against the stone with a harder, sharper note that echoes off the brick walls of the terraces. The traffic increases, other carts and carriages appearing from side streets to merge into the flow, and Hal must pay closer attention to the reins, guiding the mare around a stalled dray and past a costermonger pushing a barrow piled with winter cabbages. The smell of the air changes too, the clean green scent of the fields replaced by a thicker mixture of coal smoke, horse manure, hot bread from a bakehouse, and the faint, ever-present background of the river, a cool, muddy smell that grows stronger as the cart descends toward the Thames. You sit up straighter on the cart bed, watching the buildings grow taller and closer together, the cottages replaced by brick warehouses and the hedgerows by iron railings. The people on the streets are more numerous here, men in cloth caps and leather aprons, women with baskets over their arms, children in patched coats running alongside the cart for a few paces before peeling away into alleys. The noise of the city is a low, constant hum composed of many individual sounds, the cry of a rag-and-bone man, the clang of a bell from a distant church, the clatter of wheels, the slap of footsteps on wet pavement. It is not loud so much as dense, a deep layering of sound that you are not accustomed to, but do not find unpleasant, and it washes over you as you ride, a different kind of quiet. The cart turns east along the river road, and the Thames comes into view between the warehouse roofs, a broad band of grey-brown water that gleams dully under the overcast sky. Ships and barges ride at anchor, their masts a forest of bare poles that sway very slightly with the current, and smaller boats dart among them, wherries and lighters rowed by men in dark coats. The smell of the river is stronger here, a mix of mud, tar, wet timber, and something faintly salty, and you breathe it in as the cart pulls alongside a long stone wharf where the granary stands. The granary on Thames Street is a tall building of yellow brick, its walls blackened in streaks by years of coal smoke, its roof a steep pitch of Welsh slate. It rises 5 stories above the wharf, each floor fronted by a line of wooden loading doors with iron hinges, and a wooden gantry crane projects from the uppermost level, its arm swinging slowly in the breeze that moves along the river. The ground floor is open to the wharf through a wide archway, and inside you can see the dim shapes of sacks and crates stacked against the walls, the gleam of a brass weighing scale, and the pale face of the warehouseman, who stands at a high desk near the entrance, writing in a ledger with a quill pen. Hal steers the cart to the edge of the wharf, pulling up beside a row of other carts that are being loaded or unloaded, and he sets the brake with the same wooden lever before climbing down to stretch his legs. The warehouseman looks up from his ledger and nods at Hal, then at you, a small acknowledgement that contains no surprise because the delivery was expected. He is a thin man with spectacles of wire-rimmed glass, wearing a waistcoat of faded black sarge and a white shirt whose cuffs are ink-stained, and he closes the ledger over his finger to keep his place before walking out to the cart. You help Hal unfasten the webbing and lift the first crate down to the flagstones, where the warehouseman examines the address on the lid, comparing it to an entry in a small notebook he takes from his waistcoat pocket. He runs a finger along the rope, checks the corners for damage, finds none, and then gestures toward the interior of the granary, where an open space has been left among the stacked grain sacks. Hal carries the first crate inside, his boots ringing hollow on the stone floor, and you carry the second, the weight of 40 traps pressing down through your arms and settling into your shoulders with a familiar burden. Inside the granary, the air is cool and dry, and filled with the sweet, dusty smell of stalled wheat, a scent so dense that it seems to coat the back of your throat. The floor is laid with broad flagstones worn smooth by the passage of countless feet and the dragging of countless sacks, and the walls are lined with wooden bins that hold the grain in sloping mounds. Light enters through high windows of wired glass, falling in dusty shafts that angle down across the interior, and the sound of the river outside is muted here, reduced to a low, watery whisper that echoes gently in the rafters. You set the second crate beside the first, straightening it so that the addresses face outward, and you step back while the warehouseman opens his notebook again and makes a small mark with a pencil. He counts the crates silently, his lips moving. Then he makes another mark, and then he closes the notebook and returns it to his waistcoat pocket. The warehouseman nods at you, a brief inclination of the head that serves as both receipt and dismissal, and you return the nod before walking back out to the wharf where the grey mare stands with one hind hoof cocked, resting. The light has begun to change as the afternoon wears on, the pearl sky darkening very slightly toward the east, and the river has taken on a pewter sheen that reflects the silhouette of the warehouses on the far bank. You stand on the edge of the wharf for a moment, looking out at the water, watching a lighter drift downstream with its single oarsman pulling slow and steady, and then you turn back to the cart, where Hal is already settling the webbing and coiling a loose rope. The two of you make the return journey in the same companionable silence, the cart lighter now without the crates, the mare stepping more briskly with the reduced load. The city peels away behind you, the cobblestones giving way to gravel, the brick terraces to hedgerows, the dense hum of London fading into the soft rustle of evening wind in the bare trees. The sky darkens by slow degrees, the pearl turning to a deeper grey that flushes briefly with a pale band of rose along the western horizon before subsiding into the blue-grey of dusk. You ride with your back against the forward board, your coat collar turned up against the cooling air, and you feel the quiet tiredness of the journey settling into your bones, a tiredness that is mostly stillness and staring, the fatigue of a day spent watching the world pass by at a walking pace. By the time the cart rounds the last bend and the dark shape of the cottage appears against the hedgerow, the first stars have begun to show through the thinning cloud, small cold points of light that wink in the deep blue overhead. Hal pulls up at the gate and you climb down from the cart bed, your legs a little stiff from the ride. You thank him in a few quiet words, and he nods, touching the brim of his hat before chirping to the mare and continuing along the lane toward his own village. The cart rumbles away into the dusk, the harness brass jingling a final time before the sound is swallowed by the bend, and you stand alone by the gate under the wide, darkening sky. The cottage is still and dark. No lamp lit in the kitchen window yet. And you let yourself in through the front door, hanging your coat and hat on their pegs, before going to the workshop to check on the stove. The room is warm still, the banked coals glowing a steady dull orange behind the iron grate, and the air smells of oil and beech and the faint sweet residue of tallow from last night's candles. You stand in the middle of the workshop, empty now of the crates and the straw, the bench bare except for the folded oilcloth and the wooden trays that held the traps. The absence of the crates is not a loss, but a completion, and the empty bench feels like a promise of the next batch, which will begin soon enough. Outside, the stars sharpen in the cold sky, and the river, many miles away, continues its slow, dark slide past the granary where 80 mousetraps sit in their straw nests, waiting for the quiet work that only the mice will ever see. The cart drops you at the gate in the late afternoon, the grey mare's hoofbeats fading along the lane until the only sound is the soft rustle of the hawthorn hedge settling back into stillness after the disturbance of your passing. You lift the iron latch and swing the gate open, stepping into the yard where the grass has dried since morning and now crackles faintly under your boots, each blade a pale straw colour in the flat light of the declining sun. The cottage stands before you with its familiar silhouette, the thatch dark and heavy, the chimney issuing a thin wisp of smoke from the stove you left banked in the workshop, and the windows are blank squares that show no lamplight yet, because the day is not quite done. You walk around to the workshop door, the same outer door you left latched this afternoon, and you pause with your hand on the wooden handle to look once more at the lane behind you, now empty all the way to the bend, the ruts of Hal's cart, the only evidence that anything passed this way today. Then you push the door open and step inside, closing it behind you with a soft click that seals out the cooling air. The workshop received you with its steady warmth, the stove still breathing its low orange glow through the grate, and the air carries the familiar mixed scent of linseed oil, beech dust, and the faint metallic tang of the steel wool you use for cleaning. The room is dimmer than when you left, the window's grey light having thinned to a pale wash that barely reaches the far corners, and the shadows have lengthened across the stone floor so that the legs of the bench and the stool cast long dark stripes toward the door. You stand still for a moment, letting the quiet settle around you after the motion of the cart, the rumble of the wheels, the changing sounds of the road and the city. The quiet here is different from the quiet of the lane or the granary. It is a deep, enclosed stillness that seems to have been waiting for your return, a held breath that will not release until you have completed the final tasks of the day. Those tasks are small and many, and you begin them without hurry, as you begin everything in this room. Your coat you take off first, hanging it on its peg beside the inner door, and your hat goes onto the shelf above, its brim brushing the low ceiling beam where the spider still sits in its corner, motionless. You unlace your boots and set them on the mat by the door, pulling on a pair of soft leather shoes that you keep under the bench for the indoor hours, and the change of footwear is a small comfort, a signal that the journey is over and the workshop has you back. The stove needs a fresh log, which you select from the basket and lay across the embers with the iron tongs, waiting a moment for the bark to catch before closing the door and adjusting the damper to a middle position that will keep the room warm through the evening. The fire crackles once, twice, and then steadies into a low murmur, and you turn to face the bench where the tools have waited all day in their places. The tools are the first objects to receive your care, because they have served you through the entire making of the traps, and now deserve to be cleaned and sharpened, and put away in proper order. You go to the shelf above the bench, and take down the small tin of linseed oil, the clean cotton rags folded in a neat pile, and the wet stone box that holds the oilstone in its shallow bath. These you arrange at the center of the bench, and then you light the oil lamp, because the window light has faded further, and you will need a steady flame to see the fine edges of the blades. The lamp catches with a soft puff, the yellow glow spreading across the bench and illuminating the tools that hang on the wall, each one waiting to be handled one last time before the day ends. The plane is the first tool you take down, the same smoothing plane whose iron you sharpened midway through the planing of the bases, and you carry it to the bench where the lamplight falls brightest. You loosen the lever cap and slide out the cutting iron and chipbreaker assembly, separating the two parts with a careful twist of your fingers. The iron shows a faint line of wear along its edge under the light, a tiny brightening where the beech's silica dulled the steel, and you set to work on the oilstone, adding a few drops of oil from the crute before placing the bevel flat against the stone. The sound of the sharpening is a low, wet scrape, a gritty hiss that rises and falls as you move the blade in small circles, and the oil darkens to a grey paste that spreads across the stone in a thin film. You work the bevel until the dull line disappears, replaced by a uniform grey polish, and then you turn the iron over to remove the wire burr, a few light strokes on the flat side that produce a faint metallic whisper. The leather strop comes next, its surface dark with jewellery's rouge, and you pull the edge across it 3 times, 4 times, until the blade catches the lamplight in a hairline of silver so fine that it seems to cup the air itself. The chip breaker you wipe clean of any trapped shavings, using a corner of rag to reach the small crevice where dust likes to hide, and then you reassemble the plane, setting the depth adjustment to neutral and wiping the sole with an oily cloth until the steel gleams with a dark, wet sheen. The plane goes back onto its hook, its weight settling against the wall with a soft thud, and you turn to the next tool. The chisels are 3 in number, each one used at a different stage of the work, and you take them down from their rack one by one to attend to their edges. The narrow chisel that cut the mortises has a blade of just 3/16 of an inch, its bevel still sharp but in need of a touch-up after the many taps of the mallet against the beech. You hold it to the lamp and sight along the edge, seeing a tiny reflection where the steel has rolled a fraction, a microscopic burr that your thumb can just barely feel. The oilstone receives this blade with the same wet hiss, the narrow bevel easy to sharpen because its surface is so small, and you work it with short, precise strokes that follow the original angle without deviation. The second chisel, the tiny one used for the underside notches, requires even less work because its cuts were few and light, and a few passes on the strop alone restore its edge to a polished keenness. The third chisel, the one you used for the catch slots, has a slightly wider blade and needed a bit more attention, a small flat spot having formed near the heel of the bevel which you grind away with patient circles on the stone. Each chisel, when finished, is wiped with the oily rag and hung back in its place, the 3 blades forming a descending row of gleaming silver against the dark wood of the rack. The hand saws, of which you have 2, need a different kind of care because their teeth cannot be sharpened on the oilstone and must instead be cleaned and oiled against rust. You take down the fine-toothed saw first, the one that cut the blanks from the planks, and you lay it flat on the bench so that the lamplight runs along its toothed edge. A small brass bristle brush, kept in a jar of kerosene, serves to scrub between the teeth, removing the compacted sawdust that has lodged in the gullets and which, if left, would draw moisture and cause pitting. You work the brush along the entire length of the blade, the bristles hissing faintly against the steel, and the kerosene lifts the dust in a pale slurry that you wipe away with a rag. The blade now shows its true color, a dark gray with a faint blue bloom from the mill, and you apply a thin coat of linseed oil to both sides, spreading it with a rag until the metal gleams. The teeth you test with the pad of your thumb, feeling for any hook or burr, and finding none you hang the saw back on its peg above the bench. The second saw, a coarser rip saw used only for the initial cutting of the planks into smaller sections, receives the same attention, its larger teeth easier to clean, and its heavier blade requiring a thicker application of oil to keep the rust away during the idle days until the next batch begins. The marking gauge is next, a tool whose sharp steel pin must remain bright if it is to scribe a clean line, and you unscrew the brass slide to remove the pin from its housing. The pin is a simple piece of round stock ground to a point, and you sharpen it by rolling it between your fingers on the oilstone, a delicate motion that restores the conical tip to its original sharpness. The wooden body of the gauge you wipe down with a cloth barely dampened with linseed oil, rubbing the worn spot where your palm has darkened the beech to a rich brown, and then you reassemble the tool and set it back on its shelf. The awl and the carpenter's pencil stub receive a similar moment of attention, the awl's point tested against your thumb and found adequate, the pencil sharpened with a few strokes of the pocket knife, before being laid in the shallow groove of the bench tray, where it will wait for the next marking session. The brass mandrel and the hand crank, which wound the springs, need to be cleaned of the oil that you applied during the coiling, and which has now thickened slightly with the fine dust of the workshop. You take the mandrel from its bracket, and wipe it with a rag soaked in a little spirits of turpentine, the solvent cutting through the old oil and leaving the brass bright and dry. The steel crosspin you polish with a scrap of fine emery cloth until it shines, and then you apply a fresh, very thin coat of linseed oil to the entire surface before replacing the mandrel in its bracket. The crank mechanism gets a drop of oil at its pivot point, worked back and forth a few times to distribute the lubricant, and the wooden handle is wiped clean of the grey residue your palm left during the winding. The straightening block you unclamp from the vise and brush free of any metal particles that might have lodged in its bushings, a quick task performed with a pipe cleaner dipped in oil, and then the block is returned to its shelf beside the mandrel. The cutting pliers and a small screwdriver need only a wipe and a drop of oil at their hinges, motion so brief that you complete them in the time it takes to walk from the bench to the rack and back. The testing dowel, which is rolled into the corner of the tray, is returned to the jar of spare dowels, and the glazed jar of catches, now empty, is wiped clean of the dust that gathered on its glass and placed back on the shelf where it will wait to be filled again. The tea tin of triggers, likewise empty, has its lid pressed on firmly, and you stack it beside the jar. The little dish of brass screws you return to the drawer, sliding it into its designated spot beside the awl and the spare story sticks, and the drawer closes with a soft wooden thump. The bench itself now lies exposed, its oiled surface covered with a fine scattering of wood dust, metal filings, and the dried smears of linseed oil that have accumulated over the days of work. You take the wide bench brush, a block of beech with stiff horsehair bristles, and you sweep the surface clean with long, even strokes that move the debris toward the edge where you hold a dustpan made of tin. The dust slides into the pan with a hiss, and you empty it into the pail of scrap that will go to the compost pit, returning the brush to its hook and the dustpan to its nail. Then you wet a rag with clean water, wring it out until it is barely damp, and wipe the length of the bench from end to end, removing the last oily residue and leaving the wood with a matte, slightly cool surface that gleams in the lamplight. The bench dogs you pull from their holes and wipe individually, their square pegs darkened by handling, and you tap them back into place with a single blow of the mallet. Now the floor needs sweeping, because the shavings that escaped the basket and the sawdust that drifted beyond the canvas sheet have formed a thin layer of pale brown dust over the stone flags. You take the broom from its corner, a long-handled besom of twicky birch bound with wire, and you begin at the far end of the workshop near the store cupboard, working your way across the floor with slow, deliberate strokes that gather the dust into a broad, curving pile. The broom whispers against the stone, a steady shush, shush, shush that sounds like a gentler version of the plane's note, and the dust rises in small puffs that catch the lamplight before settling again. You sweep under the bench, around the stool, past the stove where the ash has spilled in a fine grey ring, and you add the ash to the pile, its darker colour swirling into the paler wood dust like cream into tea. The pile grows as you work toward the door, and when you have swept the entire floor, you collect the debris in the wide dustpan and carry it outside to the compost pit behind the garden, tipping it onto the heap of vegetable peelings and grass cuttings where it will break down into soil by next winter. The evening air is cool and still, the stars beginning to prick through the high cloud, and you stand for a moment breathing it in before returning to the warmth of the workshop. The stove you attend to now, because it has burned through the log you added when you returned, and the coals are sinking into a bed of fine white ash. You open the door and use the poker to shake the grate gently, the ash falling through into the pan below, and then you add 2 fresh logs from the basket, placing them crossways so that they will burn slowly and evenly through the night. The damper you adjust to a low setting that will keep the room from growing too cold, but will not consume the wood before morning, and the stove ticks its quiet gratitude as the new fuel catches. The ash pan you slide out and carry to the ash bucket by the door, emptying it with a soft rush of grey powder, and then you replace the pan and close the stove door for the final time today. Now you turn to the last and quietest of the tasks, the setting out of fresh planks for the morning. You walk to the stall cupboard and open its plank door, reaching into the darkness where the remaining beech and deal and elm are stacked, and you select 2 planks of beech, 1 of deal, and a short thick piece of elm, carrying them in a bundle to the trestles that you have already moved to the center of the floor. The planks you arrange across the trestles in the order they will be used, the beech first and the elm last, and you lay the marking gauge and the pencil stub beside them so that everything is ready for the first cuts of the next batch. The linen cloth you take from the windowsill, where it has been airing all day, and you drape it over the planks to keep the night's damp from settling into the grain, tucking its edges under the ends with a few light pats. The sight of the cupboard planks, waiting in the quiet workshop, holds a soft promise of the work to come, a promise that requires no thought or acknowledgement, merely the trust that the morning will find them as they are now. The workshop is now as clean and as orderly as it ever gets. The tools gleaming on their hooks, the bench bare and wiped, the floor swept, the stove glowing, the planks ready. You stand in the center of the room and let your eyes travel slowly across each familiar surface, the rack of chisels, the curl of the lamp's smoke against the ceiling, the dark square of the window that now reflects the room back at you in a dim mirror. The quiet is total. The only sound the low murmur of the stove and the faint tick of cooling metal from the lamp, and it presses around you like a held breath. You have done everything that needed doing, and there is nothing left but to close the workshop for the night. You walk to the window and take hold of the wooden shutter, pulling it closed with a creak of its iron hinges, and you drop the bar into its bracket to secure it against any wind that might rise before dawn. The window becomes a black rectangle, and the room shrinks inward, the lamplight now the only source of illumination. At the bench, you trim the wick of the lamp with the small snuffers, reducing the flame to a tiny blue bead, and then you cup your hand behind the chimney and blow gently, the flame vanishing with a thin trail of smoke that curls upward and disappears. The room darkens except for the orange glow of the stove's grate, which paints a faint, wavering pattern on the stone floor and the lower edge of the bench. You stand in this dim warmth, letting your eyes adjust, feeling the quiet settle even deeper as the lamp's absence removes the last active element from the room. Your hands find the inner door by habit, the wooden latch lifting smoothly under your fingers, and you step through into the passageway that leads to the cottage kitchen. The passage is dark and cool, smelling of the bread that baked earlier and the faint lavender of the linen press, and you close the workshop door behind you with a soft click that is the final sound of the day's labor. Beyond the passage, the kitchen is warm and dim, the embers of the cooking fire still red in the grate, and a single candle burns on the table where your supper waits under a cloth. You'll eat quietly, and then you will sleep, and the workshop will hold its silence through the night. Behind the closed door the stove blows on, the damper set low, the logs settling with a soft crumble of ash. The tools hang motionless, the clean blades reflecting the faint orange in tiny pinpricks of light. The covered planks rest on the trestles, the linen cloth a pale ghost in the darkness. The window shutter stands firm, and beyond it the night has fully fallen, the stars sharpening in the cold sky, the lane empty and silent, the meadow a dark expanse where the sheep are invisible now. The traps are far away, tucked into their straw nests in the granary on Thames Street, and the mice of London have not yet discovered them, will not discover them for many nights to come. The workshop holds its peace, waiting for the first grey light to touch the thatch and the blackbird to return to the grass and the maker to open the shutter once more. The quiet of the empty room is complete, a stillness so deep that it seems to breathe, and nothing moves except the slow, silent fall of night.